The Nebraska wind cut like a knife through Eleanor Reed's worn coat, stealing her breath as she leaned into the leather traces of the overloaded wagon. At 43, with her dead husband's child heavy in her belly, she had no business hauling 1,000 pounds of household goods across frozen ground. But the homestead deed sewn into her coat lining bore her name now, and winter wouldn't wait for spring's gentler mercy. When the wagon wheels sank deep into rutted clay, her breath came in desperate puffs against the bitter air. 7 months along carrying Thomas's final burden gift, or burden depending on how the wind blew her thoughts. The endless expanse of the Nebraska territory stretched before her, an ocean of brown grass and gray sky. Snow had begun falling, delicate flakes that belied the coming storm. Eleanor paused to wipe sweat from her brow, despite the cold. Her hands, once steady enough to extract bullets from writhing soldiers, now trembled with exhaustion. The war had taught her endurance, but this journey was testing limits she hadn't known existed. A sound in the distance made her freeze, the unmistakable snort of a horse well not domesticated. Eleanor squinted through the falling snow, catching sight of a Mustang stallion watching her from a ridge. The animal pawed the ground, its breath visible in the cold air, nostrils flaring as it caught her scent. "Easy now," she whispered, though the beast was too far to hear. The stallion charged without warning, racing down the slope toward her wagon. Eleanor's heart hammered as she fumbled for the revolver tucked in her coat. Thomas had taught her to shoot during their early years together before silver fever and gambling debts had consumed him. Now, with the wild horse bearing down on her, she thanked him for that much at least. Her fingers closed around the gun's grip as the stallion approached. The animal circled the wagon, snorting and stamping, attracted by the feed sacks tied to the side. Eleanor raised the revolver with both hands, aiming skyward. The last bullet she had saved for emergencies. This qualified. The shot cracked across the prairie, startling a flock of birds from a distant copse of trees. The stallion reared front hooves, pawing the air, before it turned and galloped away, disappearing into the thickening snowfall. Eleanor sagged against the wagon, her heart pounding. The baby kicked inside her as if sharing her fear or perhaps her relief. She tucked the now useless gun back into her pocket and touched her swollen belly. "It's all right," she murmured. "We're still moving forward." The homestead deed felt like a talisman against her chest, sewn carefully into the lining of her coat. 160 acres of good farmland, according to the surveyor's notes, with a creek running through the southwest corner and timber enough for building. It was 20 miles ahead, the last leg of a 200-mile journey that had consumed her last pennies and the remnants of her strength. The snow fell heavier now, swirling in gusts that obscured the road. Eleanor squinted at the darkening sky. She'd planned to reach a small stand of trees by nightfall for shelter, but the weather was turning faster than expected. Doubt crept in, like the cold had she miscalculated. Was this journey foolhardy rather than brave? Hoofbeats sounded behind her, rhythmic and purposeful, unlike the wild stallion's charge. Eleanor tensed her hand, moving instinctively to her empty gun. Travelers on this road could be friend or foe, and a woman alone with an obvious pregnancy made an easy target. The rider appeared through the curtain of snow, a tall man on a chestnut gelding, his broad shoulders dusted white. He slowed as he approached, keeping a respectful distance. Eleanor noted the quality of his horse and tack. Not a drifter or desperado, but someone of means. "Ma'am," he called, touching the brim of his hat. "Storm's coming in fast. You're headed for trouble with that wagon." Eleanor straightened, one hand resting protectively over her belly. "I'm aware of the weather, sir." The man dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. Up close, she could see he was older than she'd first thought, perhaps mid-50s, with silver threading through his dark hair and beard. Deep lines framed gray eyes that assessed her situation with concern rather than threat. "Jackson Whitaker," he introduced himself. "I own Whispering Pines Ranch about 5 miles south of here." Eleanor hesitated before offering her name. "Eleanor Reed." His gaze took in her condition, the overloaded wagon, and the traces she'd been pulling herself. His expression shifted from concern to something like quiet admiration. "Mrs. Reed, I don't mean to presume, but you won't make another mile before this storm hits full force. My ranch has plenty of room, and you'd be welcome to shelter until it passes." Pride warred with practicality in Eleanor's mind. She'd made it this far alone, had survived worse conditions during the war, tending the wounded, while battles raged nearby. But the baby complicated matters. It wasn't just her life at stake. I don't accept charity, Mr. Whitaker. Not offering charity, he replied evenly. Just common sense. Storm like this could bury your wagon for days. As if to punctuate his words, the wind gusted sharply, driving snow into her face. The wagon creaked ominously as the wheels sank deeper into the softening ground. Eleanor studied the man before her. His clothing was practical but well-made, his manner straightforward. There was something in his bearing that spoke of command, a military man perhaps. During the war, she'd learned to read men quickly to determine who could be trusted in crisis. "How do you propose to move my wagon?" she asked, practical concerns winning out over pride. Whitaker gestured to his horse. "Cisco can pull that. I'll walk alongside." The first real contraction gripped Eleanor, then a warning tightening that made her gasp. The baby wasn't due for weeks yet, but the strain of pulling the wagon had taken its toll. Whitaker noticed her discomfort immediately, his expression sharpening with concern. "Mrs. Reed." "Just tired," she lied, straightening. "Your offer is appreciated. I accept until the storm passes." Relief crossed his features. "Good. Let's get you settled before this gets worse." Within minutes, he had transferred the traces to his horse and secured her belongings. Eleanor climbed awkwardly onto the wagon seat, embarrassed by her clumsiness, but grateful to be off her feet. Whitaker led the horse on foot, navigating the increasingly treacherous path with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of the territory. The snow fell in earnest now, transforming the landscape into a whirling white void. Eleanor huddled deeper into her coat, one hand pressing against another contraction. False labor, she told herself, just her body protesting the strain. 20 years as a nurse, the last 4 of those in field hospitals during the bloodiest war in American history, had taught her about childbirth. She wasn't due yet. The baby would wait. Through the veil of snow, structures began to emerge, first the outlines of a barn, then fences, and finally a substantial 2-story house. Whispering Pines Ranch, aptly named for the stand of tall pines that sheltered the buildings from the worst of the wind. Lights glowed in the windows, promising warmth Eleanor had almost forgotten existed. As they approached the barn, a figure emerged, small and bundled against the cold, holding a lantern aloft. "Mr. Jackson," the figure called, voice accented but clear. "You found someone." "Get the guest room ready, Lynn," Whitaker called back. "And some hot tea." Eleanor squinted at the figure, surprised to see an older Chinese woman hurrying back toward the house. Whitaker caught her expression and offered a brief explanation. "Lin Chen keeps house for me. Best cook in the territory, and twice as smart as most men I know." He helped Eleanor down from the wagon, his hands strong but careful at her elbows. Another contraction seized her as her feet touched the ground, stronger than before. She gritted her teeth against it, determined not to show weakness. The barn was blessedly warm after the biting cold outside, the air rich with the scent of hay and horses. Whitaker unsaddled his gelding with efficient movements, speaking softly to the animal as he worked. Eleanor watched him, noting the practiced ease of his routine. A methodical man, orderly in his habits. That suggested reliability at least. "Ranch this size," she said, breaking the silence, "must require a fair number of hands." Whitaker nodded. 6 regular men more during calving and roundup. They've got cabins behind the barn. Good men, most of them. "And Mrs. Whitaker?" Eleanor asked carefully, needing to understand the household she was entering. A shadow crossed his face. "Sarah's been gone 5 years now." "I'm sorry for your loss," she offered automatically, the phrase worn smooth from countless repetitions during the war. "As I am for yours," he replied, nodding toward her wedding ring. Eleanor's hand went to the simple gold band. "Thomas died in a mining accident in Colorado 7 months ago." Whitaker didn't offer platitudes, just a nod of acknowledgement that Eleanor found oddly comforting. He finished with his horse and picked up her carpet bag from the wagon. "House is this way. Watch your step path, gets icy." The main house of Whispering Pines stood solid against the storm, a testament to careful building and regular maintenance. 2 stories of sturdy timber, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides, it spoke of prosperity earned through years of hard work. As they climbed the steps, Eleanor noticed carved details around the doorframe, pine branches, and small animals executed with surprising delicacy. Lin Chen met them at the door, her small figure dwarfed by the heavy oak panel. Up close, Eleanor could see she was perhaps 60, with silver-streaked black hair, pulled into a practical bun, and keen dark eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Reed needs a warm room and rest," Whitaker said, stomping snow from his boots. The storm caught her on the road. Lynn's gaze took in Eleanor's condition with swift assessment. Baby coming soon, she observed matter-of-factly. I prepare hot water and clean sheets. Not for a few weeks yet, Eleanor corrected her, unwilling to acknowledge the increasing frequency of her contractions. Just tired from traveling. Lynn made a skeptical sound but didn't argue. This way, please. Room is ready. She led Eleanor through a comfortable sitting room, past a large stone fireplace where flames crackled invitingly, and up a staircase to the second floor. The guest room was spacious and well-appointed with a four-poster bed, a washstand with pitcher and bowl, and a small writing desk near the window. A fire had already been lit in the smaller fireplace, taking the chill from the air. Rest now, Lynn said, turning down the bed covers. I bring tea and something to eat. Left alone, Eleanor sank gratefully onto the edge of the bed. Another contraction gripped her, impossible to deny now. The baby was coming weeks early and in the middle of the worst storm she'd seen since leaving Missouri. Of all the complications she'd anticipated on this journey, premature labor in a stranger's home hadn't been among them. She pressed her hands to her lower back, trying to ease the ache. On the bedside table stood a framed photograph she hadn't noticed before, a family portrait. Whitaker, looking somewhat younger, stood behind a seated woman with a delicate face and sad eyes. Two children flanked them, a boy of perhaps 12 and a girl slightly younger, both with their mother's features and their father's serious expression. Eleanor leaned closer, noticing something else in the photograph. Whitaker wore a uniform Confederate gray. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She'd accepted shelter from a former enemy, a man who had fought against everything she'd spent 4 years trying to preserve. The war had ended 19 years ago, but some wounds never fully healed. Eleanor had spent those 4 bloody years in Union field hospitals, watching young men die by the hundreds. Men killed by bullets fired by soldiers in gray uniforms, just like the one in the photograph. She was still staring at the image when Lynn returned with a tray bearing tea and bread. Mr. Jackson's wife, Lynn explained, noticing Eleanor's focus. Miss Sarah, very beautiful, very sad lady. Eleanor set the photograph down carefully. She was lovely. Mr. Whitaker mentioned she passed 5 years ago. Lynn nodded, pouring tea into a delicate china cup. Heart too heavy for this world. 2 children gone to cities, big house too quiet. She faded away like morning frost. Another contraction seized Eleanor, stronger than before. She couldn't hide her wince. Lynn set down the teapot with a decisive click. Baby coming now. I helped many births before. How far apart pains? Perhaps 15 minutes, Eleanor admitted, but it's too soon. Baby decides not, mother, Lynn interrupted practically. I tell Mr. Jackson bring hot water. No, Eleanor caught the older woman's arm. Please, not yet. I need... She glanced at the photograph again. I need to understand who's offering me shelter. Lynn's shrewd eyes followed Eleanor's gaze to the Confederate uniform in the picture. Understanding dawned in her expression. Ah, you were Union. It wasn't a question. Eleanor nodded slowly. I was a nurse, field hospitals mostly, Antietam, Gettysburg, Cold Harbor. Lynn was quiet for a moment, then spoke softly. War long over, Mrs. Reed. Mr. Jackson not talk about it much. Good man who lost much like you. She paused. Like me. There was a story there, Eleanor sensed, but another contraction, barely 10 minutes after the last, prevented her from asking. Lynn noticed her expression and nodded decisively. I get things ready. You drink tea. Baby waits for no one, not even old quarrels. After Lynn left, Eleanor sipped the tea, finding it surprisingly soothing. The storm howled outside, rattling the windows in their frames. She was effectively trapped here in the home of a former Confederate officer about to give birth weeks ahead of schedule. The irony might have made her laugh if the situation weren't so precarious. She thought of the homestead waiting 20 miles away, a property she'd never seen, the focus of all her hopes since Thomas's death. Would she ever reach it now? Or was this another cruel twist in a life that had seen more than its share of hardship? A sharp knock at the door preceded Whitaker's entrance. He carried a large copper kettle of steaming water, which he set carefully on the washstand. Lynn says the baby's coming, he said without preamble. We've sent for Doc Mitchell from town, but in this storm, he left the sentence unfinished. Eleanor met his gaze directly. I saw the photograph. You fought for the Confederacy. If her bluntness surprised him, he didn't show it. I did. 5th Virginia Cavalry under Fitzhugh Lee. Ended the war as a captain. I was at Antietam, Eleanor said, watching his reaction carefully. And Gettysburg. Field nurse with the Union Medical Corps. Something flickered in Whitaker's gray eyes, recognition perhaps, or memory. Then we were on opposite sides of the same hell, Mrs. Reed. Before Eleanor could respond, the strongest contraction yet doubled her over. Whitaker was at her side, immediately supporting her elbow until it passed. The war's been over a long time, he said quietly. Right now you need help, and I can provide it. Politics aside, Cecil. Eleanor looked up at him, seeing not the uniform from the photograph, but the man before her now offering assistance without condition to a woman who had once tended his enemies. The absurdity of maintaining old hatreds while new life demanded attention suddenly struck her. Your Lin Chen seems to know something about midwifery, she conceded. And you're right, the baby won't wait for the storm to pass or for old soldiers to finish refighting the war. Whitaker's expression softened slightly. I'll send her up. And Mrs. Reed, whatever happened during those 4 years, it's not happening now. You're safe here. After he left, Lynn returned with clean linens and more hot water. The labor progressed rapidly, as if the baby, having decided to arrive early, was now in a hurry to meet the world. Eleanor, who had assisted with countless births during and after the war, found herself grateful for Lynn's quiet competence as she transitioned from caregiver to patient. The night deepened the storm's fury, matching Eleanor's labor pains as they grew in intensity. Lynn remained steady throughout, her small hands surprisingly strong as they helped Eleanor through each contraction. Whitaker stayed downstairs, appearing occasionally to bring more hot water or fresh towels, but tactfully keeping his distance from the birthing room itself. Near midnight, as the worst of the storm began to abate, Eleanor felt the final overwhelming urge to push. Lynn positioned herself capably, murmuring encouragement in a mixture of English and Chinese. 3 massive contractions later, the baby slid into the world with a decisive wail that announced her arrival more effectively than any herald. A girl, Lynn announced quickly, cleaning the infant's airways and wrapping her in a soft flannel blanket. Strong lungs, good color. Perfect. She placed the squirming bundle on Eleanor's chest. Exhausted beyond measure, Eleanor stared down at her daughter's red, wrinkled face with a surge of love so fierce it brought tears to her eyes. The baby had Thomas's dark hair, but her own determined chin. A fighter like her mother. Grace, Eleanor whispered the name coming to her unbidden. Grace Reed. A prayer for her daughter's future, and perhaps for her own. Lynn smiled, the first true smile Eleanor had seen from the reserved woman. Beautiful name, beautiful baby. I tell Mr. Jackson good news. Left alone with her daughter, Eleanor marveled at the perfect tiny features, the surprising strength in the small fingers that curled around her own. Thomas would never know, this child never see, how his recklessness had nonetheless resulted in something miraculous. The thought brought both sadness and a strange relief. Grace would never know, disappointment at her father's hands never watch him ride away with promises that rarely materialized. A soft knock announced Whitaker's return. He entered hesitantly, his usual confidence tempered by the sanctity of the moment. Lynn says mother and daughter are doing well, he said, keeping his distance from the bed. Eleanor nodded, too tired for pretense. Thanks to your hospitality and Lynn's skills, we've imposed on you more than I ever intended. Whitaker shook his head. No imposition, Mrs. Reed. New life is always welcome at Whispering Pines. He paused, then added quietly, my Sarah loved babies. She'd have been pleased to know a child was born in this house again. The simple statement, offered without artifice, touched Eleanor unexpectedly. She saw grief in the man's eyes, not fresh, but mellowed by time into something bearable, if never quite healed. Would you like to meet her? Eleanor offered impulsively. Her name is Grace. Whitaker approached the bed cautiously, as if afraid of disturbing the fragile new life it contained. His weathered face softened as he gazed down at the infant, who was now sleeping peacefully against her mother's chest. She's perfect, he said simply. You must be very proud. Mostly I'm relieved, Eleanor admitted. Giving birth alone on the prairie during a blizzard wasn't part of my plan. A faint smile touched Whitaker's lips. Life rarely follows our plans out here. The land teaches humility to everyone eventually. His gaze lingered on Grace for another moment before he straightened, resuming his more formal demeanor. You should rest, Mrs. Reed. Lynn will look after anything you need." After he left, Eleanor settled deeper into the pillows, cradling Grace against her. The storm had quieted to gentle snowfall outside, and the fire burned low in the grate. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt truly safe. The irony that this security had come in the home of a former Confederate officer wasn't lost on her. In the quiet aftermath of birth, as her body began the long process of healing, Eleanor drifted into an exhausted sleep filled with fragmented dreams. She was back at Antietam, moving through the makeshift hospital tents where hundreds of wounded men lay suffering. One face kept appearing, a young captain with gray eyes, his shoulder torn by shrapnel fever burning through him as she cleaned and bandaged the wound. "You'll live, Captain," she told him in the dream, "but you'll carry this scar forever." She woke with a start to find Lynn beside the bed, gently lifting Grace from her arms. "You rest," the older woman said softly. "I watch baby while you sleep." Too tired to protest, Eleanor relinquished her daughter and sank back into the pillows. The dream lingered at the edges of her consciousness, that wounded captain with familiar gray eyes. Surely it was just her mind mixing past and present, inserting Whitaker's face into old memories. There had been so many wounded, so many faces blurred by exhaustion, and the constant pressure of too many patients, too little time. She slept again, dreamlessly this time, waking only when Lynn brought Grace back for feeding. The simple primal connection with her daughter anchored Eleanor in the present, pushing away ghosts of the past. Whatever came next, she had this miracle to focus on, this new life that depended entirely on her strength and determination. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white drifts and crystal clear blue sky. Eleanor sat propped against pillows, watching sunlight sparkle on snow-laden pine branches outside her window. Grace slept in a makeshift cradle Lynn had prepared from a dresser drawer lined with soft blankets. A knock at the door announced Whitaker, who entered carrying a small wooden box. "How are you feeling?" he asked, keeping his voice low to avoid waking the baby. "Better than expected," Eleanor answered truthfully. "Your Lin Chen has a healer's hands." Whitaker nodded. "She's saved more than one life on this ranch, including mine once or twice." He set the wooden box on the bedside table. "I thought you might like this for the baby." "It was Sarah's. She kept small mementos in it. Seems fitting it should hold something for your daughter now." Eleanor opened the box carefully. Inside lay a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. She lifted it, surprised by such a personal gift. "Mr. Whitaker, I couldn't—" "Jackson," he corrected her. "And yes, you can. Sarah would have wanted another mother to have it." Eleanor held the locket in her palm, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Jackson." His name felt strange on her tongue, a small but significant shift from formality towards something more personal. Jackson seemed to feel it too, his expression softening briefly before he changed the subject. "Lynn tells me you were a nurse during the war." Eleanor nodded, wondering if he would mention her fevered mumbling during labor. Had she spoken of Antietam aloud? Had she revealed more than she intended? "4 years with the Union Medical Corps," she said. "I joined after my father died. There was nothing keeping me in Missouri, and they needed every pair of trained hands they could get." "You saw the worst of it then," Jackson said quietly. "As did you, I imagine." Eleanor studied him, trying to reconcile the Confederate officer from the photograph with the man before her now. "You were a captain." "By the end, yes." He looked out the window, his gaze distant. "Started as a lieutenant, believed in the cause, with the certainty of youth and privilege. Ended as a captain who'd seen too much death to believe in much of anything." The honesty in his statement resonated with Eleanor's own experience. She'd entered the war believing in the rightness of the Union cause, in the evil of slavery, in the clear moral lines between North and South. She'd left it understanding that suffering recognized no borders, that dying men cried for their mothers in the same voice, regardless of the color of their uniforms. "I treated wounded from both sides when I could," she said. "After Antietam, especially, there were so many and not enough doctors or nurses for either army." Jackson's attention sharpened at the mention of the battle. "You were at Antietam, in the field hospital near Sharpsburg. 3 days without sleep, hundreds of wounded, not enough of anything, clean bandages, chloroform, even water was scarce." The memories came flooding back with unexpected clarity. "The surgeons worked assembly line fashion, one to administer chloroform if we had it, one to cut, one to suture. We nurses moved between them, trying to keep the patients from bleeding out before they could be treated. Jackson had gone very still, his expression unreadable. I was wounded at Antietam. Shoulder shrapnel, high fever afterward. They told me later a Union nurse saved my life, kept the wound from festering when the Confederate surgeons had given up. Eleanor stared at him, the dream from the previous night suddenly taking on new significance. The captain with the gray eyes, the shrapnel wound in his shoulder. Could it possibly be left shoulder? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson nodded slowly. How did you know? Eleanor's heart raced. I treated a Confederate captain with a shrapnel wound to the left shoulder. He was feverish, delirious at times. The wound was badly infected when they brought him in, but there was something about him, a strength, a will to live. I stayed with him through the night, cooling his fever, cleaning the wound hourly. You sang, Jackson said softly. A hymn, I think. I remember a woman's voice, gentle but firm, telling me I wasn't allowed to die. The confirmation sent a shiver through Eleanor. Amazing grace, I sang it to the dying and those I thought we might save. It was the only comfort I could offer when medicine wasn't enough. They stared at each other across the room, the weight of this impossible coincidence hanging between them. Enemies on a battlefield 19 years ago, now connected by the thin thread of a shared memory in the accident of a snowstorm. Grace stirred in her makeshift cradle, breaking the tension with a small, mewling cry. Eleanor reached for her daughter, automatically wincing slightly at the movement. Jackson took a step toward the door. I'll let you rest. There's no hurry for you to leave. The roads will be impassable for days yet. I've imposed enough, Eleanor began, but he cut her off with a raised hand. A woman who once saved my life can hardly be considered an imposition, Mrs. Reed. You and Grace are welcome at Whispering Pines for as long as you need. After he left, Eleanor cradled Grace against her chest, mind reeling from the revelation. Of all the ranches in Nebraska, of all the storms that might have driven her to seek shelter, she had ended up in the home of a man whose life she had once saved on a blood-soaked battlefield a lifetime ago. She looked down at her daughter, sleeping peacefully now after nursing. Grace, she whispered the name, taking on new layers of meaning. Amazing Grace indeed. The days that followed took on a dreamlike quality as Eleanor recovered her strength and adjusted to motherhood. Lin Chen proved invaluable, showing Eleanor how to bathe the newborn, how to swaddle her properly, how to recognize different cries and what they meant. The older woman's experience was evident in every careful instruction, every gentle correction, when Eleanor's city-bred knowledge proved inadequate for frontier practicalities. Jackson kept a respectful distance, appearing at mealtimes and inquiring after their welfare, but otherwise absorbed in ranch business. The storm had caused some damage to outlying fences and stranded cattle in remote pastures, requiring his attention and that of his ranch hands. On the third day, Eleanor ventured downstairs for the first time, carrying Grace carefully. The main floor of the house revealed itself to be as well appointed as the guest room, with solid handcrafted furniture and touches of refinement unusual for a frontier ranch. Books lined shelves in the study, their leather bindings suggesting a collector, rather than merely a casual reader. Paintings hung on the walls, landscapes mostly, but also a larger portrait of Sarah Whitaker that captured both her beauty and the sadness that seemed to haunt her even in photographs. Eleanor was studying this portrait when Jackson found her. Lynn said you were up and about, he said, standing in the doorway. How are you feeling? Stronger every day, Eleanor replied, shifting Grace in her arms. Your home is beautiful. Jackson's gaze moved to his wife's portrait. Sarah had an eye for beauty. Most of what you see was her doing the paintings, the furniture, the gardens outside when the snow melts. Lynn mentioned she was unhappy toward the end. Jackson didn't immediately answer, his expression turning inward. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, as if choosing words with care. Sarah was raised in Charleston society. Marrying me meant following to a Virginia plantation, then to this wilderness after the war. She tried to bring civilization with her ordered books and artwork from back east, planted flowers that had no business growing in Nebraska soil, held on to customs that made no sense 300 miles from the nearest city. He paused. I thought providing material comfort was enough. I was wrong. The simple admission revealed more about the man than any of their previous conversations. Eleanor recognized in Jackson something she'd seen in Thomas, a fundamental inability to understand what his wife truly needed. But unlike Thomas, Jackson had learned from his failure carried the weight of it with a gravity that spoke of genuine regret. Loneliness can kill as surely as any disease, Eleanor said softly, thinking of the endless months she'd spent waiting for Thomas to return from his latest venture, the slow erosion of hope with each broken promise. Jackson nodded. The children left as soon as they were old enough. William to Boston for university, Rebecca to Chicago to study art. They write occasionally, visit rarely. I think the ranch reminds them too much of their mother's unhappiness. And you stay, Eleanor observed, despite the memories. This land is part of me now, Jackson said simply, for better or worse. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside, the sound of horses approaching at speed. Jackson moved to the window, his posture suddenly alert. One of my men, he said, riding hard. He strode to the front door, Eleanor following more slowly with grace. On the porch stood a young ranch hand, his horse breathing hard steam rising from its flanks in the cold air. "It's Tudor Whitaker," the young man said urgently. "It's Daisy the prize heifer. She's calving early and it's gone wrong. Mason sent me to fetch you." Jackson was already reaching for his coat. "How long has she been in labor?" "Since dawn, sir. Calf's turned wrong, Mason thinks. He's afraid we'll lose both." Eleanor stepped forward before she could reconsider. "I may be able to help." Both men turned to her in surprise. "I've assisted with difficult births before," she explained. "Human and animal. The principles are similar." Jackson hesitated only briefly. "Daisy's our best breeding stock, worth more than most of the herd combined. If you're sure you're strong enough." "I am," Eleanor said firmly, though in truth she was still weak from her own recent labor. Lynn can watch Grace. 20 minutes later, Eleanor found herself in a warm barn facing a distressed heifer, while ranch hands watched with undisguised skepticism. She'd handed Grace to Lynn, who had appeared with a wool blanket and practical advice about keeping the birth fluids off Eleanor's dress. The heifer lay on her side in a bed of clean straw sides, heaving with exhaustion, eyes rolling in pain and fear. A middle-aged ranch hand, Mason presumably, stood nearby, his expression shifting from doubt to desperate hope as Jackson explained Eleanor's nursing background. "Ma'am, with all due respect," Mason said, "birthing babies and birthing calves ain't exactly the same." "More similar than you might think," Eleanor replied, rolling up her sleeves. "I'll need hot water, clean rags, and some kind of lubricant. Lard will do if you have nothing better." Her calm authority seemed to reassure him. He nodded to a younger hand, who hurried to fulfill her requests. Eleanor approached the heifer, slowly speaking in soothing tones as she assessed the situation. The animal was indeed in trouble. She could see a single hoof protruding, but at the wrong angle for a normal birth. The calf was turned probably shoulder first, a dangerous presentation that could kill both mother and offspring without intervention. "I need to turn the calf," she explained to Jackson, who stood nearby. "It will hurt her, but it's the only chance they both have." He nodded grimly. "Tell us what you need." "Mason should hold her head. You and the others will need to keep her from thrashing too much when I reach inside." The men positioned themselves as directed, Jackson at the heifer's hindquarters, Mason at her head, murmuring reassurances to the frightened animal. Eleanor took a deep breath, coating her arm with the lard a young hand had brought. "Hold her steady now," she instructed. Eleanor worked methodically, her mind focused entirely on the task at hand. The war had taught her to compartmentalize, to set aside discomfort, exhaustion, and even pain when lives depended on her actions. Now she channeled that same disciplined focus feeling for the calf's position, gradually manipulating it toward a safer angle for delivery. The heifer bellowed in pain, struggling against the men's restraining hands. Eleanor persisted, speaking soothingly while her arms performed the delicate work of repositioning the calf without causing further harm. "There," she said at last, feeling the calf shift into the proper position. "The head and front legs are aligned now. She should be able to deliver normally, but she's exhausted. We may need to help pull." Jackson nodded to two of the younger hands, who quickly fetched clean ropes. Under Eleanor's direction, they looped these around the calf's front legs as they emerged, providing gentle but firm traction in rhythm with the heifer's contractions. 30 minutes of focused effort later, a wet, gangly calf slid into the world, immediately attended to by Mason, who cleared its airways and rubbed it vigorously with straw to stimulate breathing. The little creature responded with a shaky attempt to rise, drawing exclamations of approval from the watching ranch hands. "A heifer calf," Mason announced with satisfaction. Looks just like her mama. The mother cow was already turning to sniff her offspring maternal instinct, overcoming exhaustion. Eleanor stepped back, suddenly aware of her own fatigue as the adrenaline of the emergency faded. Jackson was at her elbow, supporting her with a steadying hand. That was remarkable, Mrs. Reed. The ranch hands were looking at her with newfound respect, nodding acknowledgement of her skill. Eleanor felt a flush of pride, not vanity, but the simple satisfaction of having made a difference, of having saved lives through knowledge and determination. Just applied anatomy, she said modestly. The same principles apply across species. Maybe so, Jackson replied, but not everyone would have known how to apply them or had the courage to treat. He guided her toward the barn door. Let's get you back to the house before you collapse. You've done enough heroics for one day. The walk back to the main house was slow, Eleanor leaning more heavily on Jackson's arm than she would have liked to admit. The exertion had cost her more than as she'd anticipated, her body reminding her forcefully that she was barely 4 days postpartum. Lynn met them at the door, Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms. Baby good, she reported. Mother looked tired. Mrs. Reed just saved our prize heifer and her calf, Jackson explained. A feat worthy of any doctor. Lynn nodded as if this were exactly what she'd expected. Army nurse know many things. Come sit by fire, I bring tea. Eleanor sank gratefully into a chair near the hearth, accepting Grace back into her arms. The simple weight of her daughter centered her, bringing her focus back to what mattered most, this new life that depended on her, the future they would build together once they reached their homestead. Jackson remained standing, watching them with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite interpret. Thank you, he said simply. Daisy represents years of careful breeding. Losing her would have been a significant setback. I'm glad I could help, Eleanor replied. It's been some time since I've had a chance to use my medical training. You mentioned you were at Antietam, Jackson said, his tone careful. In Gettysburg. Eleanor nodded, wondering where this was leading. In Cold Harbor, toward the end. That was the worst. So many young men lost for so little gain. Jackson's expression darkened at the mention of Cold Harbor, one of the war's most futile and bloody battles. I wasn't there, he said quietly. By then I was in a hospital in Richmond recovering from Gettysburg. A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken memories of those terrible years. Finally, Jackson spoke again. It seems impossible that we should meet like this after all this time. That the woman who once saved my life should appear at my door 19 years later in need of shelter. Providence, perhaps. Eleanor suggested, surprising herself with the thought. She'd lost faith in divine intervention long ago, somewhere between Antietam's bloodbath and Thomas's countless disappointments. Perhaps, Jackson agreed, or simply the land bringing together those who belong to it in its own time. The idea resonated with Eleanor in unexpected ways. She'd come to Nebraska seeking ownership of land, a physical deed to a tangible property. But perhaps there was another kind of belonging at work here, something deeper than legal documents could capture. Lynn returned with tea, breaking the moment of philosophical reflection. As she poured the steaming liquid into cups, Eleanor noticed something she'd missed before, a shadow of old sorrow in the older woman's eyes, visible only in certain lights, certain angles. Lynn, she asked impulsively, how did you come to Whispering Pines? The Chinese woman's hand stilled briefly on the teapot. She glanced at Jackson, who nodded slightly, as if giving permission to share her story. I come from California, Lynn said, her accented English careful and precise. San Francisco, many Chinese there. My husband Chen Wei work on railroad, then opened small shop. We have son-daughter. Her voice faltered slightly. Good life for time. She set the teapot down, her composure returning as she continued. Then bad men come, say Chinese take jobs. Burn shops, hurt people. My husband, children. She shook her head, unable to finish. Jackson picked up the narrative quietly. There were anti-Chinese riots in San Francisco in '77. Many lost their lives, more lost everything they owned. Lynn was one of the few survivors from her neighborhood. Mr. Jackson fined me when buying cattle in California. Lynn continued. I cook at small hotel where he stay. He offered jobs, safe place far from California. 8 years now. The simple recounting of such tragedy, delivered without self-pity, humbled Eleanor. Her own losses, painful as they were, seemed somehow smaller in comparison to the complete devastation Lynn had endured. I'm so sorry, she said inadequately. Lynn straightened, her dignity palpable. Past is past. Now I have work purpose. Mr. Jackson, good man. Whispering Pines, good place. She looked at Eleanor directly. You understand loss. Makes you see people truly. With that profound observation, Lynn excused herself to prepare dinner, leaving Eleanor and Jackson in thoughtful silence. She's remarkable, Eleanor said finally. One of the strongest people I've ever known, Jackson agreed. She's taught me a great deal about resilience. Eleanor looked down at Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms. We all carry our stories, don't we? The visible and invisible scars. Yes, Jackson said softly. The question is whether those scars define us or merely mark the journey we've taken. The philosophical turn of his thought surprised Eleanor again. This man was not what she had expected. Not the rough frontier rancher, nor the unrepentant Confederate officer she might have imagined from the photograph. Jackson Whitaker was a man of depth and contradiction, of failure, and learning of wounds both given and received. As the evening settled around them, snow beginning to fall again outside the windows, Eleanor found herself wondering what path had led him from a Virginia plantation to this Nebraska ranch, from a Confederate uniform to a life shared with a Chinese immigrant woman, and now temporarily at least with a Union nurse and her newborn daughter. Their stories had intersected twice now, once on a battlefield where she had saved his life without knowing his name, and again on a snow-covered road where he had perhaps returned the favor. What that might mean for their futures, Eleanor couldn't begin to guess. For now, it was enough to sit by the fire holding her daughter close in a moment of peace neither of them could have imagined during those blood-soaked days at Antietam. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, a gentle counterpoint to the crackling fire. Within the solid walls of Whispering Pines Ranch, 3 wounded souls, each marked by different tragedies, different losses, shared a quiet evening, finding in each other's company a respite from the solitude of grief and the weight of memory. Eleanor looked up to find Jackson watching her, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. Something unspoken passed between them. Not romance, but a more fundamental recognition. 2 survivors who had seen the worst of humanity and somehow retained the capacity for kindness, for connection, for hope. Grace stirred in her arms, a small hand reaching up to touch Eleanor's cheek. The simple gesture centered her, pulling her attention back to the present moment, to the miracle she held. Whatever complications lay in her past or Jackson's, whatever uncertainties waited in the future, this much was certain: she would build a life for her daughter, one secure enough to weather whatever storms might come. The homestead deed sewn into her coat lining suddenly felt less like a talisman and more like a promise, not just of land to own, but of roots to put down, of a place to belong. 20 miles away, that future waited. But for tonight, Eleanor was content to remain by the fire, cradling her daughter in the unexpected sanctuary of a former enemy's home. A week passed at Whispering Pines, each day adding strength to both Eleanor and Grace. The snow began to melt under clear skies, turning the ranch yard into a patchwork of white drifts and muddy earth. Eleanor established a routine, dividing her time between caring for Grace and helping Lynn with household tasks, simple at first, then gradually more complex as her body healed. Jackson maintained a respectful distance, busy with ranch matters that had accumulated during the storm. Their interactions were cordial but careful, both of them navigating the strange territory between strangers and something more. The shared knowledge of their battlefield connection hovered between them, acknowledged but not fully explored. On the 8th morning, Eleanor woke before dawn, restless with thoughts of the homestead waiting 20 miles away. Grace slept peacefully in her makeshift cradle, her tiny features relaxed in the kind of perfect contentment only infants could achieve. Eleanor watched her daughter breathe, marveling again at the miracle of new life emerging from so much loss. Outside the window, the eastern sky lightened from black to deep blue, then to the pale gold of approaching sunrise. Eleanor dressed quietly, mindful not to wake Grace. She needed airspace to think beyond the confines of the bedroom that had become both sanctuary and increasingly a kind of prison. Her body was healing well, but her mind felt clouded by indecision and an unfamiliar reluctance to move forward with her plans. The house was silent as she made her way downstairs, though a light glowed from the kitchen, where Lynn likely prepared for the day ahead. Eleanor bypassed it, stepping instead onto the front porch, where the cold morning air cleared her head instantly. The ranch spread before her, outbuildings emerging from shadow as dawn approached the pine grove that gave the property its name, standing sentinel against the lightning sky. To the east, where her homestead waited, the prairie stretched in gentle undulations, still partially snow-covered, but with patches of brown grass emerging. "You're up early." Eleanor turned to find Jackson standing at the far end of the porch, a steaming cup in his hands. He wore no coat despite the cold, just a thick wool shirt and the weathered trousers that seemed to be his daily uniform. "I needed some air," she explained, "and time to think." He nodded understanding without need for elaboration. "Coffee, please." He disappeared briefly into the house, returning with a second cup, which he handed to her without comment. The coffee was strong and black, sweetened with just a touch of molasses in the frontier style. Nothing like the weak brew she'd grown accustomed to during the war when real coffee had been scarce and chicory substitutes common. They stood in companionable silence, watching the sun breach the horizon in a spectacular display of orange and gold. Leonore felt some of her tension ease, the simple beauty of the moment pushing away her tangled thoughts. "You're thinking about your homestead," Jackson said finally, not a question but a statement. Eleanor nodded. "The roads must be passable soon. Grace and I have imposed on your hospitality long enough." "You're not an imposition," he replied, the phrase familiar between them now. "But I understand your desire to claim what's yours." The wording struck Eleanor as apt. The homestead deed represented more than land. It was independent security, a future she'd carved out from the wreckage of her life with Thomas. She'd traveled 200 miles to claim. It endured hardship and near disaster. 20 more miles shouldn't feel so daunting. Yet something held her back, a reluctance she couldn't quite name. "Where exactly is your claim?" Jackson asked, breaking into her thoughts. Eleanor described the location as best she could from the surveyor's notes on the deed. "Section 12, Township 14 North. The papers mention a creek and good timber, first building." Jackson's expression shifted subtly. "Blackwood Creek. You know it?" He nodded slowly. "It borders my northern pastures. The land there is good fertile soil, adequate water. It's been unclaimed because it's somewhat isolated. The nearest neighbor would be Whispering Pines, and we're not exactly close." The information should have reassured Eleanor. Instead, she felt an inexplicable unease. How isolated? 10 miles to the nearest small settlement, 20 to a proper town with supplies. Jackson studied her over the rim of his coffee cup. "It's not an easy place for a woman alone with an infant." "I'm not afraid of isolation," Eleanor said, perhaps too quickly. "During the war, I learned to be self-sufficient." "The war had supplies, structure, purpose," Jackson countered. "The prairie just has silence and distance. It breaks people differently than battle does." The observation was unexpectedly perceptive. Eleanor thought of Sarah Whitaker's portrait, the sadness in her eyes despite material comfort and family surrounding her. The prairie's isolation had broken that woman's spirit. Could it break hers as well? "I have no alternative," she said finally. "The homestead is all I have. All Grace has." Jackson didn't immediately respond, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the sun now cleared the land, spreading light across the snow-patched prairie. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, neutral. "When you're ready to see your property, I'll take you there. It's the least I can do for the woman who once saved my life." The offer hung between them, simple on its surface, but laden with unspoken meanings. Eleanor sensed that in accepting, she would be crossing some invisible boundary between them, acknowledging a connection beyond chance encounters and reluctant gratitude. "Thank you," she said finally. "Perhaps in a few days, when Grace and I are stronger." Their conversation was interrupted by Lynn's appearance at the door, her expression concerned. "Miss Grace awake hungry, looking for mother." Eleanor handed her empty cup to Jackson with a nod of thanks, then followed Lynn back into the house. As she climbed the stairs to her room, she found herself thinking about Jackson's description of her homestead: land, good soil, adequate water, extreme isolation. Was that truly what she wanted for herself and Grace? Or had she been so focused on claiming independence that she'd failed to consider the practical realities of frontier life? Grace's hungry cries dispelled further reflection. Eleanor gathered her daughter close, settling into the rocking chair to nurse. The simple physical connection centered her, as it always did. Whatever uncertainties clouded her future, this much was clear. Every decision must now be made with Grace's welfare as the priority. Not pride, not independence for its own sake, but what would truly give her daughter the best chance at a secure life. Later that morning, Eleanor was folding freshly laundered baby linens in the kitchen While Lynn prepared bread dough, the two women working in companionable silence. Grace slept in a basket nearby, undisturbed by the domestic activity around her. "Mr. Jackson say you have land near here," Lynn commented, kneading the dough with practiced efficiency. Eleanor nodded. "According to my husband's papers. I haven't seen it yet." Lynn's hands never paused in their rhythmic work, but her dark eyes assessed Eleanor shrewdly. "Hard life woman, alone, with baby. Harder than you think." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Eleanor replied, smoothing a small blanket with perhaps more force than necessary. "Not about work, about alone." Lynn shaped the dough into loaves with quick, decisive movements. "Silence speaks too loud when no one answers." The simple observation struck Eleanor with unexpected force. She'd been alone before during the long months when Thomas sought his fortune elsewhere during the war, when she'd moved from one field hospital to another. But this would be different. Complete isolation with only an infant for company miles from the nearest human voice. "I survived my husband's absences," she said, more to convince herself than Lynn. "I'll survive this too." Lynn slid the bread pans into the oven before answering. "Survive, yes, but life should be more than survive." She wiped flour from her hands, her expression softening slightly. "You watch Mr. Jackson. He survived, but not live. Not since Miss Sarah died." Eleanor considered this as she finished folding the linens. Jackson Whitaker was indeed surviving, rather than living, maintaining his ranch with methodical care, but finding little joy in it. His children's absence had left a void that ranch work alone couldn't fill. Was that to be her fate as well? Survival without connection, without community. "The homestead is all I have." She repeated the words, sounding hollow even to her own ears. Lynn made a noncommittal sound, turning to other kitchen tasks. Their conversation lapsed into silence, but Eleanor's thoughts continued to churn. The homestead represented security. Yes, but at what cost? What kind of life would Grace have growing up in complete isolation? What kind of woman would Eleanor become in such solitude? These questions followed her throughout the day, intruding on routine tasks and quiet moments alike. By evening, she'd reached no clear conclusion, only a growing awareness that her carefully constructed plans might require reconsideration. After dinner, when Grace was settled for the night, Eleanor found herself drawn to Jackson's study, a room she'd glimpsed but not fully explored. The door stood partially open, lamplight spilling into the hallway. She hesitated, then knocked softly. "Come in," Jackson called. He sat at a large oak desk, ledgers spread before him, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose. The sight was unexpectedly domestic, at odds with the weathered rancher who rode out each morning to check cattle and fences. Eleanor was reminded again of the contradictions in this man-Confederate officer and thoughtful host, frontier rancher, and reader of leather-bound books. "I don't mean to interrupt," she said, remaining in the doorway. Jackson removed the spectacles, setting them aside with the careful precision that characterized most of his movements. "Not an interruption. Ranch accounts can wait." Eleanor entered, drawn to the bookshelves that lined one wall. Volumes of history and philosophy stood alongside practical manuals on animal husbandry and agriculture. Shakespeare's collected works occupied a prominent position, their leather bindings worn from use rather than mere display. "You're a reader," she observed, running a finger along the spines. Sarah insisted on books, said they were windows when the walls closed in. A shadow crossed his face at the mention of his wife. "She was right, though I didn't appreciate it fully until she was gone." Eleanor selected a volume, Thoreau's Walden, and opened it to find the margins filled with neat annotations in a feminine hand. Sarah's thoughts on solitude and self-reliance preserved in ink long after her death. "She had a thoughtful mind," Eleanor said, replacing the book carefully. "Too thoughtful for her own happiness, perhaps." Jackson closed the ledger before him, giving Eleanor his full attention. "What brings you here tonight? I doubt it was curiosity about my library." Direct as always. Eleanor appreciated the lack of pretense, even as she struggled to articulate her own uncertainty. "I've been thinking about what you said this morning, about isolation breaking people differently than battle does." Jackson nodded, waiting for her to continue. "During the war," Eleanor said slowly, "even in the worst times there was purpose. Clear objectives, necessary tasks, the knowledge that what I did mattered to someone. Isolation removes all that. There's no one to matter to except Grace," Jackson finished for her. And a child that young can't provide the kind of human connection adults need. Exactly. Eleanor moved to the window looking out at the star-filled sky above the ranch yard. I wonder if I've been selfish, so focused on claiming independence that I haven't considered what's truly best for my daughter. Jackson was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice held no judgment, only honest reflection. After the war, I came here seeking exactly that kind of isolation. I'd seen too much lost, too much not just the cause, but my faith in most of what I'd been raised to believe. The prairie seemed like a place to disappear. But you built all this, Eleanor gestured to encompass the ranch. A successful operation, a fine home. I built it to prove something to myself, to the world, I'm not sure which, that I could create instead of destroy, perhaps. He looked around the study at the evidence of civilization carved from wilderness. Sarah came with me willingly at first. We both thought a fresh start would heal what the war had broken. We were partly right. The land gave us a livelihood, children, a future of sorts. But it took something from Sarah that I didn't understand until too late. Connection, Eleanor said softly. Community. Jackson nodded. Humans are not meant to live in isolation. Even the most self-sufficient need to matter to someone to be seen and known. The simple truth of this struck Eleanor deeply. Her plans for the homestead had focused entirely on physical survival, shelter, food, basic necessities. She'd given little thought to the psychological cost of complete solitude, especially for a woman accustomed to the purposeful work of nursing and the structured community of military life. What would you suggest? She asked, surprised at herself for seeking his counsel. Jackson considered before answering. See your land first. Know what you're claiming before you commit to it. Then decide with clear eyes, not just determination. Will you take me there tomorrow? The request came impulsively, driven by a sudden need to confront reality rather than possibilities. If you feel strong enough, he agreed. Lynn can watch Grace. It's a half-day's ride, rough in places, but the weather should hold. Eleanor nodded, decision made. Tomorrow then. As she turned to leave, Jackson spoke again. Eleanor. Her given name and his voice startled her. It was the first time he'd used it. Whatever you decide about the homestead, know that you and Grace are welcome at Whispering Pines. Not from charity, but, he paused, seeming to search for the right words, from recognition of shared history, perhaps, and shared understanding. The offer hung in the air between them, its full implications too complex to address in this moment. Eleanor acknowledged it with a slight nod. Before leaving the study, her mind both clearer and more troubled than before. That night, as she lay beside Grace's makeshift cradle, Eleanor found herself thinking of Sarah Whitaker. What had it been like for that genteel Charleston woman transported to this remote wilderness with only books and memories of civilization to sustain her? Had she loved Jackson enough to endure the isolation, or had she simply lacked alternatives? The portrait's sad eyes suggested the latter, a woman who had made the best of circumstances she couldn't change, whose spirit had slowly withered in the vast silence of the prairie. Eleanor didn't want that fate for herself or for Grace. Yet the alternative seemed equally daunting, remaining at Whispering Pines, accepting Jackson's hospitality without clear terms or expectations. What would that make her, a dependent, a charity case, or something else entirely? Something not yet defined between them. She drifted into uneasy sleep, dreams mixing past and present, field hospitals where wounded men cried out in pain, Thomas's face as he left on his final journey, the vast emptiness of the prairie stretching before her wagon. Through these images moved Jackson Whitaker, sometimes in Confederate gray, sometimes in his rancher's clothes, his gray eyes watching her with an expression she couldn't interpret. Morning came clear and cold, the kind of crystalline winter day that made the prairie seem limitless. Eleanor dressed in her warmest clothes, borrowing a heavy coat that had once belonged to Sarah. It hung loosely on her frame but provided better protection than her own worn garment. Lynn helped her prepare, offering practical advice about the journey while securing additional blankets to a saddle Jackson had modified for a woman rider. The Chinese woman's efficiency masked obvious concern. Weather changed fast on prairie, she warned. Sky clear, now not mean, stay clear. We'll be careful, Eleanor assured her, checking on Grace one final time before departure. The baby slept peacefully, oblivious to her mother's anxiety about leaving her even for a day. Lynn followed her gaze. Baby safe with me. You go see land, come back with clear mind. Jackson waited in the yard holding the reins of two horses, his own chestnut gelding, and a smaller, calmer mare for Eleanor. He'd chosen well. The mare stood patiently as Eleanor mounted awkwardly, her body still tender from childbirth, despite her improving strength. "We'll follow the creek north," Jackson explained, swinging into his own saddle with practiced ease. "Your claim starts where Blackwood Creek branches east about 10 miles from here." They set off at a gentle pace, the horses' hooves crunching through patches of snow and thawed earth. Eleanor hadn't ridden in years, not since before the war, but the rhythm came back to her gradually. They traveled mostly in silence, Jackson leading the way along game trails and natural pathways that minimized difficult terrain. The landscape changed subtly as they rode north, the gentle hills giving way to slightly more rugged country, the scattered stands of trees becoming more frequent. Eleanor found herself studying the land with new eyes, noting not just its beauty, but its practical features, where water collected, where the soil looked richest, where natural shelter might be found. By mid-morning, they reached a ridge overlooking a shallow valley where a creek wound between banks lined with bare-branched cottonwoods and willows. The water ran clear and swift, with snowmelt catching sunlight in flashes of brilliant silver. "Blackwood Creek," Jackson said, reining in his horse, "named for the dark trunks of the old cottonwoods. Your land begins just beyond that stand of trees to the east." Eleanor shaded her eyes, trying to visualize the surveyor's description from the deed. "The creek turns there. Branches, actually. The main flow continues north, but a smaller fork heads east through your claim. Good water year-round from what I've observed." They descended from the ridge, following the creek to the branch point Jackson had indicated. Here he dismounted, helping Eleanor down from her mare. They stood together at what would be the southwest corner of her property, according to the deed's description. "This is it," Jackson said simply. 160 acres of Nebraska territory stretching from here to that far ridge, and from the creek branch to about a mile north. Eleanor turned slowly, taking in the full sweep of the land that was supposedly hers. It was beautiful in a stark, elemental way. Rolling prairie with patches of trees near the creek, open grassland beyond. She could see why the surveyor had marked it as good farmland. The soil would be fertile in the creek bottomland, the water supply reliable, the timber sufficient for basic building needs. It was also completely isolated. No structures visible in any direction, no smoke from distant chimneys, no sign of human presence besides their own. The homestead she'd traveled so far to claim was truly frontier in every sense, untouched, undeveloped, utterly removed from civilization. "What do you think?" Jackson asked, watching her closely. Eleanor took a few steps along the creek bank, trying to imagine a cabin here, a garden there, smoke rising from a chimney she'd built with her own hands. Trying to picture Grace taking her first steps in this wild place, growing from infant to child to woman with no playmates, no school, no community beyond her mother. "It's exactly as described, she said finally. "Good land, good water." "But," Jackson prompted, hearing the reservation in her voice. Eleanor sighed, giving voice to the doubt that had been growing since their conversation the previous night. "But I wonder if determination alone is enough to build a life here. If pride is sufficient foundation for a home." Jackson nodded, understanding her meaning without need for elaboration. "It's one thing to survive, another to thrive." "Yes." Eleanor picked up a smooth stone from the creek bank, turning it over in her hand. "During the war, I treated men with terrible physical wounds who recovered completely, and others with minor injuries who simply lost the will to live. The difference wasn't strength or courage, it was connection. The ones who survived had someone to live for, someone who would miss them if they were gone. And here," Jackson gestured to the empty landscape around them, "here there would be no one to miss us if we disappeared. No one but Grace to hear my voice. No one for her to know beyond myself." Eleanor skipped the stone across the creek's surface, watching it bounce 3 times before sinking. "Is that truly what I want for my daughter?" Before Jackson could respond, the peaceful moment was shattered by the crack of a rifle shot. The bullet kicked up dirt near their feet, followed almost instantly by the weapon's report echoing across the valley. Jackson reacted with battlefield swiftness, pulling Eleanor behind the shelter of a large cottonwood. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Who would be shooting at us?" Eleanor asked, heart pounding, as another shot splintered bark from the tree above their heads. Not sure, Jackson replied grimly. But they're not hunting game. He peered carefully around the trunk, assessing the terrain. The shots are coming from that copse of trees across the creek. Whoever it is, they've got us pinned way down. Eleanor felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the winter air. She'd experienced enough combat situations during the war to recognize their vulnerability, exposed with limited cover and unknown assailants controlling higher ground. The horses, she said, suddenly remembering the animals they'd left ground-tied nearby. As if in response to her concern, another shot rang out, followed by the panicked whinny of Jackson's gelding. Both horses bolted, disappearing into the trees along the creek. That settles it, Jackson muttered. This isn't a mistake. Someone's deliberately targeting us. He reached inside his coat, producing a revolver Eleanor hadn't realized he carried. Stay here, I'm going to work my way along the creek bank, try to circle behind them. No, Eleanor grabbed his arm. That's exactly what they expect. They're trying to separate us. Jackson hesitated, recognizing the logic in her warning. You have combat experience, he acknowledged. What do you suggest? Wait them out. Whoever it is, they can't stay there indefinitely. The temperature's dropping, and they can't be certain they have hit us. Eventually, they'll have to investigate. As if to punctuate her assessment, the wind picked up, carrying the first flakes of new snow. The clear morning was giving way to another storm, just as Lynn had warned. Eleanor shivered, pulling Sarah's coat tighter around her shoulders. Jackson nodded, accepting her strategy. If the snow sets in, it will cover our tracks, make it harder for them to find us if we move after dark. They settled into the dubious shelter of the cottonwood backs against its massive trunk, watching the copse of trees where the shots had originated. For nearly an hour, nothing moved except the increasing snowfall, which was rapidly transforming the landscape from patches of brown and white to a uniform blanket of pristine snow. Who would want to harm us? Eleanor asked, quietly breaking the tense silence. This is unclaimed land according to the deed. Jackson's expression darkened. Officially unclaimed doesn't always mean uncontested. There's a man named Charles Blackwood who owns land to the north and east. He's been trying to expand his holdings for years, pushing out smaller ranchers, intimidating homesteaders. You think he's behind this? It's possible. Blackwood wants this entire valley. He's offered to buy my northern pastures more than once. Jackson checked his revolver, a habitual gesture that spoke of military training. He's also the local banker and has friends in the territorial government in it, a man who's used to getting what he wants. Eleanor processed this information, pieces falling into place. So a widow claiming homestead land in his desired territory would be an inconvenience easily eliminated. A widow might be persuaded to sell cheaply or scared away entirely, Jackson agreed grimly, especially one without connections or protection. The implication was clear. Eleanor and Grace alone on this isolated homestead would be vulnerable to pressure, intimidation, or worse. The deed that had represented security now seemed like a target painted on their backs. The storm's getting worse, she observed, watching the snowfall thicken. Whoever's out there will need shelter soon. Jackson nodded. We need to move too. Temperature's dropping fast. We can follow the creek back toward the ranch. The trees will provide some cover, and the water's not deep if we need to cross. They waited until the snow was falling heavily enough to obscure visibility, then moved cautiously from their shelter, staying low and using the creek bank for cover. No shots followed them. Either their attackers had retreated, or the weather had hidden their movement effectively. The journey back was arduous, made more difficult by the need to remain vigilant while battling deteriorating conditions. Without horses, they faced a long walk through increasingly deep snow. Eleanor felt the strain in her still healing body, but pressed on, driven by thoughts of Grace waiting at the ranch and the unseen threat behind them. Jackson led the way with the confidence of someone who knew the land intimately, finding game trails and natural passages that made their progress easier. Still by mid-afternoon, Eleanor was struggling, her strength depleted by the combination of physical exertion and the tension of potential danger. We need to rest, Jackson said, noting her fatigue. There's an old line shack about a half-mile ahead, basic shelter, but it will get us out of the storm. The simple cabin was little more than a one-room structure with a small iron stove, a rough bunk, and minimal supplies, emergency shelter for ranch hands caught in bad weather. Jackson quickly kindled a fire in the stove while Eleanor sank onto the bunk. exhaustion finally overwhelming her determination to remain strong. "I'm sorry," she said as warmth gradually returned to the small space. "I'm slowing us down." Jackson shook his head, his expression gentle despite the gravity of their situation. "You've done remarkably well for someone barely 2 weeks postpartum. Most men I know couldn't have made it this far." The compliment, delivered without flattery or condescension, warmed Eleanor more than the fire. She had spent so long proving herself first as a female nurse in military hospitals dominated by male doctors, then as a wife, managing alone during Thomas's absences. That simple acknowledgement of her strength felt like a rare gift. "What happens when the storm passes?" she asked, watching snow accumulate against the cabin's single window. Jackson checked the revolver again, a habit Eleanor now recognized as self-soothing rather than practical necessity. "We continue to the ranch. Warn my men. Ensure you and Grace are safe. And the homestead." His gray eyes met hers directly. "That's your decision. But if Blackwood is behind this, and I'd wager good money he is, then your claim just became significantly more complicated." Eleanor nodded slowly, the reality of their situation settling into her bones along with the warmth from the stove. The beautiful isolated land she'd traveled so far to claim was not simply challenging in its remoteness, it was actively dangerous. Someone was willing to kill to prevent her from establishing her homestead. "I can't risk Grace," she said quietly, the admission both painful and liberating. "Not for land, not for independence, not even for the security I thought the homestead would provide." "No," Jackson agreed. "A child's safety must come first." They lapsed into silence, the small cabin filling with the steady heat from the stove and the soft hiss of snow against the roof. Outside, the storm continued unabated, transforming the prairie into a blank white canvas that erased boundaries, trails, and human markers alike. Inside, Eleanor felt a similar transformation occurring in her own mind, the careful plans and rigid determinations of the past months giving way to a more fluid understanding of what safety and security truly meant. "Tell me about Thomas," Jackson said, unexpectedly breaking the contemplative silence. Eleanor looked up, surprised by the request. "Why?" "To understand how you came to be here pulling a wagon across frozen ground with a child nearly due." There was no judgment in his tone, only genuine curiosity. Eleanor considered the question, realizing she'd shared very little about her late husband. "Thomas Reed was a dreamer," she said finally, "always convinced the next venture would be the one that made our fortune gold in Colorado, silver in Montana, timber rights in Oregon." A sad smile touched her lips. "He had a gift for seeing possibilities where others saw only obstacles, and for leaving you to manage while he chased those possibilities," Jackson observed astutely. "Yes." Eleanor traced a pattern in the rough blanket beneath her. "I married him at 19 when his optimism seemed like courage and his restlessness like ambition. By 30, I'd learned to live with constant disappointment and broken promises. Yet you stayed." "I loved him," she said simply, "not always wisely but completely. And there were good times between the absences, weeks or months, when he'd return full of stories and affection, convinced that this time he'd found the path to security." Jackson nodded, understanding, evident in his expression. Men often mistake motion for progress, especially after the war. So many of us came home, changed, unable to settle into the lives we'd left behind. "Thomas wasn't in the war," Eleanor clarified. "He paid a substitute to serve in his place, common practice in Missouri, where loyalties were divided. While I tended wounded soldiers, he pursued business opportunities created by the conflict." She hadn't intended the comparison to sound bitter, but Jackson caught the edge in her voice. "You resented that." "I did," Eleanor admitted. "Though I told myself it was practical, one of us should be building our future while the other served the cause. But when I returned from field hospitals, where boys younger than my brothers had died by the hundreds, Thomas's concerns seemed trivial. His complaints about business, the setbacks offensive when compared to the suffering I'd witnessed. The war divides those who've seen it from those who haven't," Jackson said quietly. "Creates a gulf of understanding that's almost impossible to bridge." Eleanor nodded, recognizing the truth in his observation. "We never found our way back to each other, not completely. The distance grew with each of his ventures and each of my silent comparisons. And the homestead, his final gift, or so I thought. The claim came with his effects after the mining accident. The banker in Omaha advised me to take it start fresh where no one knew my business. Eleanor's hand went instinctively to her coat where the deed remained sewn into the lining. I sold everything, loaded what remained into the wagon, and set out for Nebraska, determined to build something lasting from Thomas's final dream. Jackson was silent for a moment, absorbing her story. When he spoke, his voice held a new note of respect. You've shown remarkable courage, Eleanor. Few women or men, for that matter, would have undertaken such a journey alone. Courage or desperation, she countered with a small smile. Sometimes it's difficult to distinguish between them. Perhaps they're not so different, Jackson suggested. Both require facing fear and moving forward despite it. The observation struck Eleanor as profoundly true. She had been both courageous and desperate in the months since Thomas's death, afraid of an uncertain future, yet determined to forge one for herself and her unborn child. That determination had carried her across 200 miles of difficult terrain, through a premature birth in a stranger's home, and now through a snowstorm with unknown assailants potentially in pursuit. Yet sitting in this small cabin with Jackson Whitaker, former enemy, turned unlikely ally, Eleanor felt something shift within her. The desperate courage that had driven her westward was giving way to a more measured assessment of her situation. The homestead had represented independence, but independence at what cost? And was there perhaps another path to security? One that didn't require complete isolation or vulnerability to men like Blackwood. What would you do, she asked suddenly, if you were in my position with the grace to consider in a homestead claim that's clearly contested? Jackson considered the question seriously, giving it the respect she'd hoped for rather than a quick conventional answer. I'd recognize that true security comes not just from legal ownership of land, but from community, from connections to people who would stand with you against threats. He met her gaze directly. The deed gives you rights under law, but laws are only as strong as those willing to enforce them. Out here, that enforcement is often theoretical. Meaning might makes right, Eleanor translated grimly, often enough to be concerning, especially for a woman alone. Jackson added another piece of wood to the stove, watching the flames catch. Blackwood has resources, connections, and no apparent moral constraints. He's a dangerous adversary for anyone, let alone a new mother with no established allies. The assessment was blunt but accurate. Eleanor appreciated the lack of pretense, the respect implicit in his honesty. Too many men would have softened the truth, assuming she needed protection from harsh realities. So I abandoned the homestead, she said, testing the idea aloud, after coming all this way, after everything it represents. Not abandoned, Jackson corrected. Strategically reconsider. The land will still be there if conditions change. Your daughter's safety and your own well-being take precedence over any deed. Eleanor nodded slowly, the wisdom in his counsel resonating with her own growing conviction. The homestead had been a symbol of independence, of fresh beginnings, of control over her destiny. But symbols weren't worth Grace's security or her own life. What alternatives do I have? She asked, the question emerging from a place of practical assessment rather than despair. Jackson was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, deliberate. Whispering Pines has room for a skilled nurse with battlefield experience and demonstrated aptitude for animal husbandry. Lynn could use help managing the household, and He paused, seeming to search for the right words. I could use someone who sees the world clearly, without illusions or easy sentimentality. Someone who understands loss but hasn't been broken by it. The offer hung in the air between them, its implications complex and far-reaching. Not charity, not romance, but something else, a partnership of sorts built on mutual respect and shared understanding of both past and present challenges. And what would I be, Eleanor asked directly. A housekeeper, a nurse, an employee, a valued member of the household, Jackson replied with equal directness, with skills, knowledge, and perspective that would benefit the ranch. The arrangement could be formalized however you feel most comfortable, with wages, with a contract with clearly defined responsibilities and benefits. The proposal was unexpected, yet somehow inevitable, the logical culmination of the connection that had been building between them since her arrival. It offered security without dependence, community without surrender of autonomy, protection without vulnerability to men like Blackwood. I need time to consider, Eleanor said finally. This isn't a decision to make in haste. Of course, Jackson nodded, respecting her caution. The offer stands regardless of when you are ready to address it. The storm continued through the afternoon and into evening, forcing them to remain in the line shack overnight. They shared the simple emergency provisions stored there: jerky, hardtack coffee, and took turns sleeping on the narrow bunk, maintaining a careful propriety despite their isolated circumstances. Eleanor found comfort in Jackson's quiet presence, his methodical attention to practical matters, his respect for her need to process the day's revelations without pressure for immediate decisions. Here was a man who understood patience, who recognized that some journeys couldn't be rushed, and some wounds needed time to heal before new growth could begin. As she drifted into sleep during her turn on the bunk, Eleanor found her thoughts turning not to the homestead, or even to Grace waiting at the ranch, but to the silver locket Jackson had given her. Sarah's locket passed from one woman to another in recognition of shared experiences across time and circumstance. Perhaps there was something symbolic in that simple object, a continuation rather than a replacement, an acknowledgement that the past shaped the present without determining the future. Morning brought clearing skies and temperatures cold enough to set the snow crusting with ice. They left the line shack at first light, following Jackson's confident lead through the transformed landscape. With the storm past, he was able to orient them more directly toward whispering pines cutting hours from their journey. They walked mostly in silence, conserving energy for the difficult terrain. Eleanor found herself studying Jackson's profile against the brilliant white backdrop, the strong line of his jaw, the silver threading through his dark hair, the watchful alertness that never fully left his expression. A complicated man, shaped by conflict and loss, yet not hardened beyond compassion or understanding. By mid-morning, the ranch buildings came into view, smoke rising from the main house chimney in a reassuring signal of warmth and welcome. As they approached, the front door flew open, Lynn rushing out with Grace bundled against her chest. "You safe?" the older woman exclaimed, relief evident in her voice. "Storm very bad. We worry." Eleanor quickened her pace, arms reaching for her daughter. The weight of Grace against her chest centered her immediately, all other concerns temporarily secondary to the miracle of reunion. The baby was warm, content, seemingly unaware that anything unusual had occurred during her mother's absence. "The horses returned without you," Lynn explained, ushering them toward the house. "Mr. Mason and others ready to search when storm pass." Inside, the warmth of the kitchen embraced them along with the aroma of fresh bread and coffee. Eleanor sank into a chair, still holding Grace close, while Lynn bustled about preparing hot drinks and food. Jackson remained standing, briefing Lynn on their encounter at the homestead site. "Blackwood men, you think?" Lynn asked, her expression darkening. Jackson nodded grimly. "Most likely, we'll need to alert the Hands' increased patrols on the northern boundary." "I tell Mr. Mason already," Lynn assured him. "After horses, come back empty. He watched boundaries since yesterday." Eleanor listened to their exchange, noting the efficiency of their communication and the implicit trust between them. This was a household that functioned well in crisis, where each member understood their role and carried it out without need for detailed instruction. "I should check with Mason," Jackson said, finishing his coffee quickly. "Make sure the men are properly positioned." He looked at Eleanor, his expression softening slightly. "Rest. We can talk more later." After he'd gone, Lynn brought a basin of warm water and clean towels, helping Eleanor wash away the grime of their journey. The simple kindness brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. How long had it been since someone had tended to her needs with such matter-of-fact care? Since Thomas's death, certainly, and perhaps even longer. "You decide about land?" Lynn asked perceptively, taking Grace while Eleanor changed into clean clothes. "Not entirely," Eleanor admitted, "but circumstances have complicated matters." Lynn nodded, seeming unsurprised. "Land always there, safety not guaranteed." She handed Grace back, her dark eyes serious. "Mr. Jackson, good man, lonely man, but good." The simple assessment hung in the air as Lynn returned to her kitchen tasks, leaving Eleanor to contemplate its implications. Jackson Whitaker was indeed a good man, honorable, thoughtful, reliable in crisis. He was also, as Lynn had observed, a lonely man, his large house echoing with absences he'd learned to live with, but never quite accepted. Was there a place for her and Grace in that equation? Not as replacement for what he'd lost, but as something new, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared understanding of both past and present challenges. The possibility both intrigued and frightened her, offering security at the potential cost of the independence she'd sacrificed so much to achieve. Eleanor settled into the rocking chair near the kitchen fire nursing Grace while her thoughts circled these questions without reaching firm conclusions. The homestead deed sewn into her coat lining no longer felt like a talisman against uncertainty, but rather a reminder of how quickly apparent security could transform into active danger. The clear path she'd envisioned had vanished, leaving her at a crossroads with no map to guide her next steps. Outside, the winter sun illuminated a landscape transformed by snow, beautiful, treacherous, full of hidden depths beneath its seemingly uniform surface. Much like the situation Eleanor now faced with its complex layers of history, connection, danger, and possibility. Grace finished nursing and drifted to sleep against her mother's chest, the simple rhythm of her breathing a reminder of what truly mattered in this equation. Whatever choice Eleanor made must prioritize this child's welfare, her safety, her future, her chance to grow in an environment that nurtured rather than merely sustained. With that clarity as her compass, Eleanor began to see her way forward through the complexity. Not a perfect path, perhaps, but one that acknowledged reality while preserving hope. One that recognized the value of connection without surrendering autonomy. One that might allow both security and dignity, both protection and purpose. The decision wasn't fully formed yet, but its outlines were becoming clearer with each passing hour. By the time Jackson returned from his consultation with the ranch hands, Eleanor had reached, if not a conclusion, then at least a direction she was willing to explore. The real question now was whether that direction aligned with what Jackson Whitaker truly sought in offering her a place at Whispering Pines, and what complications might arise if their expectations proved fundamentally different. That conversation would have to wait until evening, when Grace was settled and the day's immediate concerns addressed. For now, Eleanor was content to sit by the fire holding her sleeping daughter, watching the interplay of sunlight and shadow across the snow-covered yard. The homestead might be lost to her, at least temporarily, but perhaps something equally valuable, something she hadn't known to seek, was being offered in its place. The afternoon passed in quiet recovery from their ordeal. Eleanor rested, spending time with Grace and helping Lynn with simple kitchen tasks as her strength returned. Jackson remained outdoors, with his men securing the ranch perimeter against potential threats from Blackwood or his associates. Eleanor found her thoughts returning repeatedly to the shooting at the homestead site. The cold calculation of it disturbed her deeply. Someone had deliberately targeted them, not with any intention of robbery or immediate confrontation, but simply to eliminate a potential obstacle to their plans. Had they been ordinary travelers, rather than a rancher familiar with the territory and a nurse with combat experience, the outcome might have been tragically different. The realization solidified her growing conviction that the homestead, however legally hers according to the deed, represented more danger than opportunity in the current circumstances. A woman alone with an infant would be desperately vulnerable to such tactics with no recourse when frontier justice proved inadequate or corrupt. As evening approached, Eleanor helped Lynn prepare dinner, finding comfort in the domestic routine. Grace slept nearby in a proper cradle Jackson had apparently retrieved from storage. A family heirloom, Lynn explained, used for both William and Rebecca in their infancy. The simple gesture touched Eleanor deeply. Not just the practicality of providing better accommodation for Grace than the makeshift drawer bed, but the symbolic significance of offering a family heirloom for her use. It suggested permanence, connection, continuity concepts that had been absent from her life with Thomas and seemed impossible during her journey to the homestead. Jackson returned as dusk fell, bringing with him the sharp scent of winter air and the focused energy of a man who had spent the day in purposeful activity. He joined them for dinner. The conversation initially centered on practical matters, increased security measures, reports from ranch hands about conditions to the north, preparations for the next potential storm. Only after the meal, when Lynn had retired to her quarters and Grace slept soundly in her new cradle, did Jackson broach the subject that hung unspoken between them. "Have you had time to consider the situation?" he asked as they sat before the fire in the study. "About the homestead and the alternative I suggested." Eleanor nodded, appreciating his directness. "I have, though I'd like to understand more clearly what you're proposing before I respond." Jackson accepted this with a thoughtful nod. "Fair enough." He was quiet for a moment, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Whispering Pines needs what you can provide: medical knowledge, household management skills, a woman's perspective on matters Lynn is too reserved to address. Beyond the practical benefits, there's the simple fact that this house has been incomplete since Sarah's death. Too quiet, too empty of purpose beyond mere survival. He paused, meeting her gaze directly. I'm not offering marriage, Eleanor. That would be premature and presumptuous given our brief acquaintance. Nor am I suggesting anything improper. What I propose is a position of respect within this household, compensated fairly with clearly defined responsibilities and appropriate independence. And what would those responsibilities include? Eleanor asked, appreciating his clarity while noting what remained unspoken. Assistance with the household management alongside Lynn. Medical care for the ranch hands and livestock when needed. Education for Grace as she grows. Jackson leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. Most importantly, partnership in decision-making about matters that affect the household. Not as an employee, but as a valued member of Whispering Pines. The offer was generous, thoughtful, and remarkably free from the patronizing attitudes Eleanor had encountered from most men. It acknowledged her skills and experience as assets rather than curiosities and offered security without demanding submission. Yet questions remained. And my status in the community, she asked. A woman living in your home unmarried with a child, there would be talk. Undoubtedly, Jackson acknowledged, though less than you might expect. The frontier tolerates arrangements that would scandalize Eastern society, particularly when they serve practical purposes. Lynn's presence provides propriety, and your position could be clearly established as professional rather than personal. Eleanor considered this assessment, finding it generally accurate based on her observations of frontier communities during her journey west. Still, there would be those who questioned, who assumed, who judged human nature being consistent regardless of geography. And if circumstances change, she pressed, if this arrangement evolves into something different over time, Jackson held her gaze steadily, then we would address that evolution honestly as adults who respect each other's autonomy and dignity. No assumptions, no unspoken expectations. The simple promise reassured Eleanor more than flowery declarations might have. Here was a man who understood the value of clarity, who recognized that true connection required honesty rather than convention or sentimentality. I cannot abandon my homestead claim entirely, she said finally. It represents security for Grace's future independent of any arrangements we might make. Nor should you, Jackson agreed readily. The deed remains valid. The land remains yours by right of claim. When Blackwood's threat is addressed, and it will be in time, you may choose to develop that property or sell it as you see fit. His immediate acceptance of her terms without negotiation or qualifications confirmed what Eleanor had begun to suspect. Jackson Whitaker sought partnership rather than possession, valued her independence rather than seeing it as a challenge to his authority. In that case, she said, decision crystallizing as she spoke, I accept your offer on a provisional basis, 3 months during which either of us may terminate the arrangement if it proves unsatisfactory. Fair compensation for my services, separate from room and board for myself and Grace, and a clear understanding that I retain full autonomy regarding my daughter's upbringing and my homestead claim. Jackson nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. Agreed on all points. We'll draw up a formal contract tomorrow if you wish. I do. Eleanor believed in his integrity, but experience had taught her the value of clear documentation. Too many women found themselves vulnerable when verbal agreements proved convenient to forget or reinterpret. With the matter settled, at least preliminarily, conversations shifted to more immediate concerns. Security measures against Blackwood, preparations for the continued winter practical arrangements for Eleanor and Grace's more permanent residence at Whispering Pines. As they talked, Eleanor felt a tension she hadn't fully acknowledged begin to ease. The desperate drive toward the homestead, the single-minded focus on claiming what was legally hers, these had been fueled partly by genuine need for security, but also by a fear of dependence that her marriage to Thomas had instilled. Jackson's offer provided a middle path, neither complete isolation nor complete dependence, but interdependence based on mutual respect and clearly defined expectations. Whether this arrangement would evolve into something more personal remained to be seen. For now, it was enough that Grace would be safe, that Eleanor would have purpose and fair compensation, and that Whispering Pines would benefit from her presence in tangible ways. Not charity, not compromise, but partnership in its truest sense. Outside, the moon rose over the snow-covered landscape, casting silver light across the pine grove that gave the ranch its name. Inside, two people shaped by war and loss, by disappointment and determination, found themselves at the beginning of something neither had expected: a connection based not on romantic notions or desperate circumstances, but on recognition of shared values and complementary strengths. It wasn't the future Eleanor had envisioned when she set out from Missouri with Thomas's deed sewn into her coat. It wasn't the independence she'd sacrificed so much to achieve. But perhaps it was something equally valuable: a chance to build security without isolation, to create community without surrendering autonomy, to offer Grace a childhood rich in human connection rather than mere survival. As she bid Jackson goodnight and returned to her room where Grace slept peacefully in her borrowed cradle, Eleanor felt a cautious optimism taking root alongside her practical assessment of their situation. The path ahead remained uncertain, with Blackwood's threat still looming and many details of their arrangement yet to be determined. But for the first time since Thomas's death, Eleanor sensed possibilities rather than merely challenges, potential rather than merely risk. The homestead deed remained sewn into her coat, lining a tangible claim to land that was legally hers, but practically inaccessible for now. Yet Eleanor no longer felt that paper was her only security or her sole connection to the future. Something new was taking shape at Whispering Pines. Something built on recognition rather than romance, on shared experience rather than sentiment. Whether it would prove lasting or temporary, whether it would evolve or remain as currently defined, these questions would be answered in time through the honest engagement Jackson had promised and Eleanor intended to maintain. For now, it was enough that Grace would sleep safely, that Eleanor had found purpose aligned with her skills, and that Whispering Pines might become not just shelter from a storm, but a place where healing could truly begin for all who dwelled within its walls. Winter settled over Whispering Pines with the heavy permanence of a sleeping bear. Snow drifted against outbuildings, ice glazed the creek, and the pine grove stood sentinel, dark green against endless white. Within this frozen landscape, life at the ranch found a steady rhythms, adapting to the season's constraints with practiced resilience. A month had passed since Eleanor and Jackson formalized their arrangement. True to his word, he had drawn up a contract that respected her terms: fair compensation, clear responsibilities, and explicit acknowledgement of her autonomy regarding both Grace and the homestead claim. Eleanor had signed it with a sense of cautious optimism, recognizing the security it provided while maintaining her independence. The transition from guest to official resident had been surprisingly seamless. Lynn welcomed Eleanor's assistance with household management, seeming relieved rather than threatened by the shared responsibility. The ranch hands accepted her presence without question, particularly after word spread of her skill in saving the prize heifer and calf. And Jackson maintained the respectful distance he'd promised, consulting her on household matters, but never presuming authority over her decisions regarding Grace. Eleanor established routines that gave structure to her days: mornings with Grace, and afternoons assisting Lynn or organizing the ranch's medical supplies, evenings in the study where she and Jackson often sat in companionable conversation, discussing books or ranch matters with equal interest. She began keeping records of the livestock's health, creating a systematic approach to preventive care that impressed even Mason, the skeptical foreman. Grace thrived in this stable environment, growing stronger daily. At 2 months, she had begun to focus on faces, showing particular interest in Lynn's animated expressions and Jackson's deep voice. Eleanor watched her daughter's development with a mixture of joy and lingering concern: joy at each small milestone, concern about what the future might hold in this uncertain arrangement. No further incidents had occurred since the shooting at the homestead site, but the threat of Blackwood loomed like a shadow at the edges of their awareness. Jackson had increased patrols along the property boundaries and sent inquiries to contacts in Lincoln about Blackwood's recent activities. The information that returned was troubling: rumors of other homesteaders pressured into selling, of territorial officials influenced by Blackwood's money, of small ranchers finding their cattle mysteriously scattered or their water sources suddenly contaminated. On a clear February morning, Eleanor stood on the porch watching Jackson and two hands ride out for a boundary check. Grace was bundled against her chest in a sling Lynn had fashioned, sleeping peacefully despite the cold. The sun cast long shadows across the snow, and Eleanor's breath formed clouds in the crisp air as she contemplated the landscape that had become, if not home, then at least a place of security. Lynn joined her carrying a steaming cup of coffee. Cold day for baby outside, she observed, though without criticism. Fresh air is good for her, Eleanor replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. And I needed to clear my head. Lynn nodded, her perceptive gaze taking in Eleanor's thoughtful expression. Something trouble you? Eleanor hesitated, then decided on honesty. Lynn had earned her trust over the past month, proving to be both discreet and insightful. A letter came yesterday from Rebecca Jackson's daughter. She's planning to visit when the spring thaw begins. Ah, Lynn's face revealed nothing beyond simple acknowledgement. Miss Rebecca, artist, now in Chicago, not visit since mother die. Exactly. Eleanor sipped her coffee, organizing her thoughts. I'm concerned about how she'll perceive my presence here in Grace's. The arrangement Jackson and I have is practical, logical, but from an outside perspective. Look like something else, Lynn finished matter-of-factly. Look like widow with baby move-in with lonely rancher. Put so bluntly, the situation did sound questionable. Eleanor sighed. Yes, and while frontier communities might tolerate such arrangements for practical reasons, a daughter from Chicago might have different expectations about propriety. Lynn considered this, her weathered face thoughtful in the winter sunlight. Miss Rebecca, good heart like father, but young still miss mother, may be difficult at first. The assessment matched Eleanor's own concerns. Rebecca Whitaker, at 26, was close to Eleanor's own age when she'd married Thomas. Young enough to hold idealistic views of family relationships, old enough to feel protective of her father and her mother's memory. Her planned visit represented the first real test of the careful balance Eleanor and Jackson had established at Whispering Pines. I've suggested to Jackson that Grace and I might move to the foreman's cabin when Rebecca arrives, Eleanor said. It would make things simpler, avoid potential awkwardness. Lynn's expression sharpened with disapproval. No, wrong message. You belong in house now, part of household. Moving looked like shame, like secret. The forthright response surprised Eleanor, who had expected Lynn to favor whatever approach would minimize conflict. You think we should maintain the current arrangement even if it makes Rebecca uncomfortable? Truth always better than pretend, Lynn stated firmly. Miss Rebecca must see real situation, not performance for her comfort. Mr. Jackson, need Grace. House better with you here. This truth. Eleanor considered Lynn's perspective, finding wisdom in its directness. Temporary relocation would indeed suggest there was something improper to hide something shameful about their arrangement. It would undermine the legitimate professional nature of her position at Whispering Pines and set a precedent of prioritizing appearances over substance. You're right, she acknowledged, though it may make for some difficult conversations. Lynn's smile was subtle but genuine. Life always difficult conversations. Better have honest ones. As if to punctuate this philosophical observation, Grace stirred against Eleanor's chest, making the small sounds that preceded waking. Lynn reached for the baby with practiced hands. I take Grace inside warm. You finish coffee, think about letter you write to Miss Rebecca before she come. Prepare ground like good farmer. The suggestion was practical and insightful. Eleanor nodded, grateful for both the advice and the momentary respite as Lynn carried Grace inside. Alone on the porch, she considered what such a letter might contain, how to introduce herself to Rebecca in a way that was honest without being defensive, clear without being cold. Before she could develop the idea, further movement at the edge of the ranch yard caught her attention. A single rider approached from the east, following the main road rather than the trails Jackson and his men had taken. Eleanor tensed, memories of the shooting at the homestead site still fresh despite the intervening weeks. She stepped back into the shadow of the porch, watching as the rider drew closer. The man sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to long journeys. His clothing marked him as a townsman rather than a rancher, a well-cut coat, a hat more suited to urban streets than open prairie. As he approached the house, Eleanor could see he was perhaps 40, with a neatly trimmed beard and the alert expression of someone constantly assessing his surroundings. He reined in at the hitching post, dismounting with practiced efficiency. Only then did he notice Eleanor, standing on the porch, partially concealed by shadow. "Good morning, ma'am," he called, touching the brim of his hat with formal courtesy. "I'm looking for Jackson Whitaker." Eleanor stepped forward, keeping her expression neutral despite her wariness. "Mr. Whitaker is checking boundary fences. He should return by midday." May I ask who's calling? The man ascended the porch steps, maintaining a respectful distance as he introduced himself. Michael Thornton, Territorial Marshal's Office, and you would be… Eleanor Reed. I manage the household at Whispering Pines. Thornton's eyebrows rose slightly at her refined speech, which clearly didn't match his expectations for a housekeeper. His gaze took in her clothing, practical, but well-made, and her composed demeanor. Mrs. Reed, he acknowledged with another slight tip of his hat. I'd be obliged if I could wait for Mr. Whitaker. I have information he requested regarding certain activities in the region. The careful phrasing suggested official business related to Blackwood, though Thornton seemed deliberately vague. Eleanor nodded, making a quick decision. Please come inside, Marshal Thornton. It's too cold to wait outdoors. Deputy Marshal, he corrected mildly, following her into the house. Though most folks just say Thornton. In the warmth of the main room, Eleanor took his coat and offered coffee, maintaining the formal hospitality that frontier custom demanded, even toward uncertain visitors. Lynn appeared, briefly assessing Thornton with one shrewd glance before disappearing back to the kitchen, where Grace's happy babbling suggested a contented morning routine. You're new to Whispering Pines, Thornton observed, warming his hands around the coffee cup Eleanor provided. I've known Jackson Whitaker for 8 years, and he's never mentioned a Mrs. Reed. And there was a question embedded in the statement, though politeness prevented him from asking it directly. Eleanor decided on a modified truth rather than a detailed explanation. My daughter and I arrived during the December blizzard. Mr. Whitaker offered shelter when we were caught on the road. I've since taken a position managing household affairs, as my homestead claim has proven complicated. Complicated, Thornton repeated thoughtfully. That would be the claim near Blackwood Creek, I'm guessing, Section 12. Sitchawell, Township 14 North. Eleanor tensed, surprised by his specific knowledge. You seem well-informed, Deputy. Thornton's expression turned grim. It's my business to know when settlers face complications in this territory, particularly when those complications might involve Charles Blackwood. The direct mention of Blackwood confirmed Eleanor's suspicion about the purpose of Thornton's visit. Then you're aware of the incident at the homestead site. Jackson's report reached me last week. Ambush from cover shots fired without warning or identification. Classic intimidation tactic. Thornton studied her with increased respect. Most women would have abandoned their claim immediately after such an experience. I haven't abandoned it, Eleanor clarified. Merely postponed development until certain security concerns can be addressed. Thornton nodded, seeming to appreciate both her determination and her pragmatism. Wise approach. Blackwood's influence makes immediate legal recourse challenging, but situations change, particularly when properly documented. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses in the yard, Jackson returning earlier than expected. Eleanor moved to the window, relieved to see him dismounting alone, his men presumably continuing their boundary patrol. She opened the door as he approached, noting the surprise that crossed his features at the sight of an unknown visitor. Jackson, this is Deputy Marshal Thornton. He's brought information regarding your inquiry. Understanding immediately replaced surprise. Jackson extended his hand to Thornton, the two men exchanging the brief greetings of those who respect each other professionally without the warmth of personal friendship. I wasn't expecting you to deliver this information in person, Jackson said, removing his coat and gloves. Thornton's expression turned serious. Some matters are better not committed to paper, especially when they involve men with friends in postal offices. The implication was clear. Blackwood's influence extended to intercept official correspondence. Eleanor excused herself to fetch fresh coffee, recognizing the men might speak more freely without her presence. In the kitchen, she found Lynn feeding Grace the baby, contentedly accepting spoonfuls of the thin porridge that supplemented her nursing. Deputy Marshal, Lynn observed. Serious man, serious business. Yes, Eleanor agreed, preparing a fresh pot of coffee. Related to Blackwood, I believe. Lynn's expression darkened at the name. Bad man. Use money like weapon turn law to personal tool. She lowered her voice, though they were alone in the kitchen. In California, men like him burn Chinese shops, kill families. No punishment because money talked to judge. The parallel hadn't occurred to Eleanor before, but it made troubling sense. The same pattern of corruption and intimidation that had destroyed Lynn's family in California was operating here in Nebraska, allowing men like Blackwood to circumvent justice through influence rather than direct violence, though violence clearly remained an option when other methods failed. "Do you think the marshal's office will actually help?" Eleanor asked, uncertain whether Thornton's visit represented genuine support or merely procedural acknowledgement. Lynn considered the question with her usual thoughtfulness. Deputy Thornton, good reputation. Fair man, follow law. But one man against Blackwood money. She shrugged expressively. Need more than law. Need community stand together. The assessment resonated with Eleanor's own experience during the war, when official authority had often proven less effective than collective action. A single doctor could treat a handful of wounded, but it took coordinated efforts from nurses, orderlies, and volunteers to manage a field hospital effectively. Perhaps the same principle applied to frontier justice individuals working together could accomplish what isolated official action could not. She returned to the main room with fresh coffee to find Jackson and Thornton in serious conversation, heads bent over papers spread across the desk. They looked up at her entrance and Jackson gestured for her to join them. "Eleanor should hear this," he explained to Thornton. "Her homestead claim is directly affected, and she has a right to know what we're facing." Thornton nodded, accepting this assessment without question, a small courtesy that Eleanor appreciated. Too many men would have insisted on excluding a woman from such discussions, regardless of her direct involvement in the matter at hand. As I was explaining to Jackson, Thornton continued, indicating the documents before them. Blackwood has been systematically acquiring land throughout this region using various methods from legitimate purchase to less conventional approaches, such as shooting at potential homesteaders, Eleanor observed dryly. Thornton's mouth twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. Indeed, though he's generally careful to maintain plausible deniability. The men who do his dirty work are rarely linked directly to him. "What's his ultimate goal?" Eleanor asked, studying the map Thornton had spread out. Red marks indicated properties Blackwood had already acquired, creating a patchwork that surrounded smaller holdings, including Whispering Pines and her own homestead claim. "Control of the watershed," Jackson answered before Thornton could respond. "Blackwood Creek feeds into the larger river system that waters this entire region. If he controls access to that water, he controls every ranch and farm for 20 miles, Thornton confirmed grimly. "Water rights are the real currency out here, more valuable than gold in the long run." Eleanor traced the creek's path on the map with one finger, seeing the strategy with sudden clarity. Her homestead claim, while modest in size, occupied a critical position where the creek branched eastward. Combined with Jackson's northern pastures, it created a gap in Blackwood's otherwise comprehensive control of the watershed. "So the shooting wasn't just routine intimidation," she said slowly. "It was specifically targeted to eliminate a strategic obstacle." "Precisely." Thornton's expression reflected newfound respect for her quick understanding. "Blackwood needs both your claim and a portion of Whispering Pines to complete his control of the water system. With those properties in his possession, he could effectively dictate terms to every farmer and rancher in the valley." The implications were staggering, not just for Eleanor and Jackson, but for dozens of families whose livelihoods depended on reliable water access. A monopoly of that scale would grant Blackwood nearly feudal power over the region, allowing him to extract payment or concessions in exchange for the most basic agricultural necessity. "What can be done?" Eleanor asked, the question directed equally to Jackson and Thornton. The deputy marshal sighed, running a hand through his beard. "Legally, our options are limited. Blackwood has been careful to keep his name separate from the more questionable activities. The territorial courts are slow to act without direct evidence, and several judges have financial relationships with Blackwood's bank." "So the law won't help," Jackson concluded, his expression hardening. "Not immediately," Thornton qualified, "but I'm building a case documenting the pattern. If enough affected parties come forward with the statements, if we can establish a clear connection between Blackwood and the intimidation tactics." He left the sentence unfinished, but the message was clear. Official justice was possible, but distant, requiring evidence they didn't yet possess, and cooperation from people who might fear Blackwood's retaliation. And in the meantime, Eleanor pressed, thinking of her vulnerable homestead claim and the families already suffering under Blackwood's expanding control. Thornton and Jackson exchanged a glance that suggested a shared understanding of frontier realities. In the meantime, Thornton said carefully, communities tend to find their own solutions when official channels prove insufficient. The statement walked a delicate line between acknowledging the necessity of collective action and officially endorsing vigilante justice. As a representative of territorial law, Thornton could not explicitly advocate the latter, but his words clearly left room for the former. A community response would require coordination, Jackson observed, studying the map thoughtfully. Many of these smaller ranchers and farmers operate independently with limited communication between properties. A network, Eleanor suggested, memories of wartime resistance efforts surfacing, information sharing, mutual support, coordinated responses to threats. Thornton nodded approvingly. Exactly the kind of approach that might prove effective while we pursue more official remedies. Though establishing such a network would require someone with organizational experience, someone the community would trust despite not being a long-term resident. His gaze rested meaningfully on Eleanor, who understood the implicit suggestion. Her background as a field nurse had given her precisely the skills needed: ability to coordinate diverse groups under pressure, to manage information efficiently, to improvise solutions when resources were limited. And her status as a homestead claimant gave her legitimate standing in the community, despite her relatively recent arrival. I would need to visit the affected properties, she said, thinking aloud rather than directly accepting the role. Establish connections, understand each family's specific situation. Dangerous? Jackson interjected, concern evident in his voice. Blackwood's men watch the roads, monitor new arrivals. A woman traveling alone would attract attention. Not alone, Eleanor countered, with legitimate business that explains my presence. Perhaps as a healer offering medical services to isolated families. She turned to Thornton. Is there a doctor in the region? Doc Mitchell in town, but he rarely travels to outlying areas, especially in winter. Thornton's expression turned thoughtful. A traveling nurse would be welcomed by most households, particularly those with children or elderly family members, and would provide perfect cover for establishing connections between properties, Jackson acknowledged, though his face still reflected concern about the potential risks. Eleanor recognized his worry, but appreciated that he didn't attempt to dissuade her or dismiss the idea outright. Their relationship over the past month had developed into a genuine partnership with mutual respect for each other's judgment and capabilities. It would need to begin gradually, she said, studying the map again. Starting with the closest properties, establishing a pattern of regular visits that wouldn't attract suspicion. Thornton nodded. I can provide names of families most likely to cooperate, those who have already experienced Blackwood's pressure tactics and have reason to resist. The three of them bent over the map, identifying potential allies and planning initial contacts. The conversation flowed with the efficiency of people accustomed to the strategic thinking, each contributing based on their particular knowledge and experience. Eleanor found herself energized by the sense of purpose, the feeling of directly addressing a threat rather than merely avoiding it. As they concluded their planning, Thornton gathered his papers with a note of caution. This stays between us for now. Blackwood has ears everywhere, and premature exposure could endanger everyone involved. Understood. Jackson and Eleanor responded nearly in unison, exchanging a brief glance of shared commitment. Thornton departed soon after, carrying not only his original information, but also detailed notes on potential allies and initial contact strategies. As Jackson walked him to his horse, Eleanor remained at the desk, studying the rough map they'd annotated during their discussion. The homestead claim that had once represented simple security for herself and Grace had evolved into something far more significant: a strategic position in a regional struggle against corruption and exploitation. The realization was both sobering and oddly exhilarating. For the first time since the war, Eleanor felt her actions connecting to something larger than personal survival or individual success. Jackson returned, closing the door against the cold with a decisive movement that seemed to punctuate the morning's developments. He stood for a moment, watching Eleanor as she traced the creek's path on the map once more. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. Your contract doesn't require risking yourself against Blackwood. Eleanor looked up, meeting his concerned gaze directly. I know, but Grace's future depends on more than our immediate safety. It depends on living in a community governed by justice rather than power, on access to resources not controlled by men like Blackwood. Jackson nodded slowly, understanding registering in his gray eyes. Still, the danger is real. Blackwood won't hesitate to eliminate threats to his plans regardless of who poses them. I'm aware of the risk, Eleanor acknowledged, but I've faced worse odds during the war with less support and fewer resources. She gestured to the map to the scattered properties marked as potential allies. This time we're not alone. We have a community to build upon, people with shared interests in resisting Blackwood's control. Something shifted in Jackson's expression, respect deepening into admiration, concern tempering with trust in her judgment. Then we'll proceed carefully with proper preparation and clear understanding of the dangers involved. The "we" didn't escape Eleanor's notice. Jackson was committing to full partnership in this endeavor, neither taking over nor stepping back. It represented a balance they'd been developing since her arrival: mutual support without dominance, shared purpose without subsuming individual agency. Their discussion was interrupted by Grace's cries from the kitchen, where Lynn had been watching her during the meeting with Thornton. Eleanor moved immediately toward the sound, maternal instinct overriding all other considerations. Jackson followed his presence, a reminder that their evolving plans must account for Grace's welfare above all else. In the kitchen, Lynn was attempting to soothe the increasingly distressed baby. "Hungry again," she explained, passing Grace to Eleanor. "Growing fast, this one." Eleanor settled into the rocking chair near the stove, adjusting her clothing to nurse Grace. The simple biological connection centered her, as it always did, a reminder of life's fundamental priorities amid complex political machinations. Whatever community organizing they undertook against Blackwood, Grace's well-being remained the non-negotiable core of Eleanor's decisions. Jackson busied himself making tea, moving around the kitchen with the comfort of a man accustomed to domestic tasks rather than expecting them to be handled solely by women. It was one of many small ways he defied Eleanor's initial expectations, demonstrating a flexibility of thought and behavior unusual in men of his generation and background. "Lynn should know about Thornton's visit," he said, setting the kettle to boil. "She has connections in the Chinese community that might prove valuable. Many work as cooks or housekeepers in the properties we're targeting." Eleanor nodded, impressed again by his strategic thinking. "An existing network we can build upon, and one Blackwood likely underestimates or overlooks entirely." "Precisely." Jackson prepared the teapot with methodical care. "The Chinese in this region communicate regularly between households, sharing news and supporting each other against discrimination. Lynn has maintained those connections since arriving at Whispering Pines." This was new information to Eleanor, who had observed Lynn's occasional trips to town, but hadn't realized they served a broader community purpose. It added another dimension to the quiet housekeeper's character, not just a survivor of tragedy, but an active participant in mutual support networks that paralleled what they now hoped to build among the region's threatened farmers and ranchers. Lynn returned from the pantry, immediately sensing that significant decisions had been made in her absence. "Deputy Marshal, bring important news," she stated, rather than asked, her perceptiveness as sharp as ever. Jackson nodded, explaining Thornton's information about Blackwood's water control strategy and their nascent plan to organize community resistance. Lynn listened without interruption, her expression shifting from concern to thoughtful calculation. "Chinese community already know some of this," she confirmed when Jackson finished. "Many houses where our people work facing pressure from Blackwood. Some already forced to sell, families moved away. Would they be willing to help us establish connections?" Eleanor asked, adjusting Grace as the baby finished nursing. "Share information, carry messages between properties." Lynn considered this carefully. "Some yes, some no. Fear strong when you lose family once already. But I talk to elders, explain importance." Her gaze moved to Grace, softening slightly. "Explain about future for children, need for water, not controlled by bad men." The simple statement captured the essence of their cause more effectively than any legal or political argument. This wasn't merely about property rights or economic justice in the abstract. It was about ensuring children like Grace could grow up in a community where basic necessities weren't weaponized for profit or control. "We'll need to move carefully," Jackson cautioned, bringing teacups to the table. "Begin with properties closest to Whispering Pines, establish Eleanor's role as a traveling nurse gradually enough to avoid suspicion." Lynn nodded, accepting a cup with a small gesture of thanks. "Start with Mason family. Wife expecting baby soon, need nurse visit, very natural." Martha Mason is pregnant, Eleanor asked, surprised. Mason, the foreman, rarely spoke of his family, despite their cabin being just a half-mile from the main house. 6 months, Lynn confirmed. First baby after many years trying. Very private, very worried because wife, small woman baby seemed large. The information presented a perfect opening for Eleanor's role as a traveling nurse, a legitimate medical visit to a family with clear need for her services. From there, she could gradually expand to other properties, establishing a pattern that would raise no suspicions while building the communication network they needed. I'll speak with Mason tomorrow, Jackson decided. Suggest you visit his wife for prenatal assessment. It would be expected, given your medical background and position at Whispering Pines. Eleanor agreed, mentally reviewing what supplies she might need for such a visit. Her nursing equipment had been among the few possessions she'd prioritized when loading the wagon, driven by professional habit rather than any expectation of practicing medicine in her new life. That foresight would now serve purposes beyond individual healthcare. As they discussed practical arrangements for beginning their resistance network, Eleanor felt a growing sense of rightness about their approach. This wasn't the independence she'd envisioned when setting out for her homestead, but neither was it the dependence she'd feared when accepting Jackson's offer at Whispering Pines. Instead, it represented something more complex and ultimately more meaningful: interdependence among community members with shared interests and values. Grace fell asleep against her shoulder, the baby's steady breathing a constant reminder of what truly mattered in this emerging conflict. Not land ownership for its own sake, not even water rights as abstract legal concepts, but the fundamental conditions that allowed families to thrive rather than merely survive. The homestead claim might have brought Eleanor to Nebraska territory, but Grace's future would keep her engaged in this fight against Blackwood's monopolistic ambitions. The following weeks saw Eleanor establish herself as a traveling nurse to families near Whispering Pines. She began with Martha Mason, whose pregnancy indeed presented concerns that benefited from professional monitoring. From there, she expanded to other households: a child with chronic respiratory problems, an elderly man suffering from arthritis, a family recovering from influenza. Each visit served legitimate medical purposes while allowing her to build relationships and quietly assess potential allies against Blackwood. Jackson supported these efforts with practical assistance, providing a horse and buggy for her travels, ensuring ranch hands were available to accompany her on longer journeys, maintaining communication with Thornton about regional developments. Their partnership deepened through this shared purpose, evolving beyond household management to encompass strategic planning and coordinated action. Lynn's connections in the Chinese community proved invaluable, creating secure channels for information exchange between properties where conventional communication might be monitored or intercepted. A network of cooks, housekeepers, and laundry workers became the invisible backbone of their resistance effort, carrying messages encoded as recipe exchanges or laundry instructions that would mean nothing to casual observers. By early March, their initial organization had expanded to include 8 families committed to mutual support against Blackwood's pressure tactics. Each household understood the water control strategy behind his land acquisitions, and each had experienced some form of intimidation or coercion. Together, they began documenting these incidents, systematically building the evidence Thornton needed for eventual legal action while establishing protocols for immediate response to threats. Throughout this period, Grace continued to thrive, seemingly oblivious to the complex adult concerns surrounding her. She grew stronger daily, her personality emerging in small but distinct ways: a determined set to her chin when frustrated, a radiant smile that transformed her entire face when pleased. Eleanor found herself sharing these developments with Jackson each evening, their conversations naturally weaving between resistance planning and Grace's latest achievements. The relationship between them evolved gradually, neither rushing nor resisting the deepening connection that circumstances fostered. Professional respect grew into personal regard, shared purpose into genuine affection. Yet both maintained a careful boundary, aware of how their situation might appear to others and mindful of the complications Rebecca's impending visit might bring. In mid-March, as the first signs of spring began to soften winter's grip, Eleanor was returning from a medical visit to a family 5 miles east of Whispering Pines. Jackson rode beside her, having insisted on accompanying her when reports came of Blackwood's men being seen in the area. They traveled in companionable silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts about the morning's work. Eleanor had successfully recruited another family to their network, German immigrants, whose limited English had made them particularly vulnerable to Blackwood's manipulative contracts. With Jackson translating, she had explained the water control strategy and offered inclusion in the mutual support system they were building. The family's relief at finding allies had been palpable, their gratitude expressed in shared food and promises of assistance when needed. As they approached a wooded area where the road narrowed between hills, Jackson suddenly raised his hand in a warning gesture. Eleanor reined in her horse, immediately recognizing the signal from their weeks of working together. "Riders ahead," he said quietly, "at least 3 waiting where the road curves." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, though she maintained outward calm. "Blackwood's men. Most likely, that curve is a common spot for ambush, limited visibility, difficult terrain on either side." Jackson assessed their options with the efficiency of a former military officer. "We can't go back without being seen from that ridge. Can't go forward without confronting them directly." Eleanor scanned their surroundings, noting a game trail that branched from the main road about 50 yards ahead. "That path to the left, where does it lead?" "Loops around to join the creek trail eventually." "Rough going, but passable." Jackson nodded approvingly at her observation. "Good eye, let's move now before they realize we've spotted them." They urged their horses forward at a casual pace, giving no indication they detected the waiting riders. As they approached the game trail, Jackson began a conversation about livestock prices, maintaining the appearance of travelers unaware of potential danger. Eleanor responded in kind, discussing a fictional auction while watching the trail entrance from the corner of her eye. When they reached the turnoff, they shifted direction smoothly, guiding their horses onto the narrow path without hesitation or backward glance. The trail immediately descended into thicker woods, providing cover from observation. Only when they were well hidden did they increase their pace, moving swiftly through the dense forest. "They'll realize we've diverted once they can see the road is empty," Jackson said, navigating around a fallen log. "Might decide to pursue depending on their specific instructions." Eleanor nodded, understanding the implications. If the men were simply monitoring travel along the road, they might not bother following. But if they had orders regarding Jackson or herself specifically, pursuit was likely. The answer came within minutes, the sound of horses crashing through underbrush behind them, moving fast without concern for stealth. Jackson's expression hardened. "They're coming. We need to reach the creek trail before they catch up. More open terrain there, better visibility." They urged their horses to greater speed, though the narrow trail limited how fast they could safely travel. Eleanor focused on staying mounted while ducking low-hanging branches, her mind calculating distances and options with the clarity that danger often brought. The creek trail was perhaps a mile ahead, according to Jackson's description. Their pursuers sounded closer with each passing minute. "There," Jackson pointed as the trees thinned, revealing a wider path following the creek they'd crossed earlier that morning. "Once we reach that, it's a straight run to Whispering Pines." They broke from the forest onto the creek trail just as their pursuers emerged from the trees behind them. A quick glance showed 3 men riding hard, one already raising a rifle to his shoulder. Jackson saw it too and shouted a warning. "Ride, don't stop for anything." Eleanor needed no encouragement. She urged her horse into a gallop, leaning low over its neck as the first shot cracked behind them. The bullet whined overhead, missing by a comfortable margin, but making clear the pursuer's intentions. This was no warning or intimidation tactic, but a genuine attempt to stop them permanently. Jackson fell in beside her, his own horse matching her pace. The creek trail offered better footing than the forest path, allowing them to maintain speed without risking a dangerous fall. Behind them, the pursuers continued firing sporadically, but the difficulty of shooting accurately from horseback at a moving target kept the bullets wide of their mark. "Ranch boundary ahead," Jackson called over the thundering hoofbeats. "Mason in the hands will hear the shots." The knowledge provided cold comfort. The boundary was still nearly a mile distant, and their pursuers showed no signs of abandoning the chase. Eleanor focused on riding her world, narrowing to the rhythm of her horse's stride and the terrain immediately ahead. All her wartime experience with emergencies served her now, keeping panic at bay while maintaining the precise focus needed for survival. Another shot came closer, kicking up dirt beside her horse's hooves. The animal shied sideways, nearly unseating her. Eleanor recovered quickly, but the momentary loss of momentum allowed their pursuers to gain ground. Jackson glanced back, his expression grim as he assessed the shrinking distance. They're gaining, he said tersely. We need to create distance or find defensible position. The creek beside them had widened, forming a deep pool before continuing downstream. Eleanor made a swift decision, based partly on calculation and partly on instinct, honed during battlefield crises. The creek, she called to Jackson. They'll expect us to stay on the trail. If we cross here, double back through those trees. He grasped her strategy immediately. Create confusion, potential crossfire when Mason's men respond. Good thinking. Without further discussion, they veered sharply toward the creek, horses plunging into the icy water with reluctant determination. The spring-swollen current tugged at their legs, but the crossing point Eleanor had identified remained shallow enough for safe passage. Their pursuers, momentarily confused by the unexpected maneuver, slowed briefly before following. That hesitation, small as it was, provided the critical advantage. Eleanor and Jackson reached the opposite bank and drove their horses up the slope into a stand of cottonwoods, positioning themselves behind thick trunks just as their pursuers entered the water. From this vantage point, partially concealed, but with clear lines of sight that they could observe without being easily targeted, Jackson pulled his revolver, checking it with practiced efficiency. Hold position, he instructed quietly. Ranch hands should be responding to the gunfire. If we're lucky, they will catch our friends in the open. Eleanor had no weapon beyond a small knife used for medical purposes, but she positioned herself carefully, ready to move quickly if the situation changed. The three pursuers had reached midstream, their horses struggling against the current as they scanned the opposite bank for their quarry. There, one shouted, spotting movement among the trees. He raised his rifle only to be thrown off balance as his horse stepped into a deeper section of the creek. Before he could recover, the sound of fresh hoofbeats approached from the direction of Whispering Pines. Mason and four ranch hands appeared on the trail, rifles ready, having responded to the gunfire as Jackson had predicted. They quickly assessed the situation, their employer and Eleanor sheltered among trees. On one bank, three armed men struggling in the creek. Whispering Pines men, Mason shouted. Drop your weapons or we open fire. The pursuers found themselves in an impossible position, caught in open water, outnumbered and without cover. After a moment's hesitation, they lowered their weapons, recognizing the futility of resistance under such circumstances. Blackwood's going to hear about this, one called defiantly, as Mason's men moved to surround them. Count on it, Mason replied grimly. And the marshal will hear about armed men chasing folks on private property. Attempted murder carries a heavy sentence in this territory. The confrontation ended with the three men disarmed and bound their horses, confiscated along with their weapons. Mason dispatched a hand to fetch Deputy Marshal Thornton, while the remaining men escorted the prisoners to Whispering Pines for holding until official custody could be arranged. As the immediate danger passed, Eleanor felt delayed reaction, setting in hands, trembling, slightly breath. Coming faster than normal, the full implications of what had just occurred finally registering. They had been targeted for elimination and escalation from the warning shots at the homestead site to direct persistent pursuit with clear, lethal intent. Jackson moved his horse alongside hers, his expression concerned as he noted her reaction. Are you all right? Eleanor nodded, gathering her composure with deliberate effort. Yes, just processing. You handled yourself remarkably well, he said quietly. That creek crossing strategy likely saved our lives. The simple acknowledgement of her contribution steadied Eleanor more effectively than any platitudes might have. This was Jackson's way, recognizing competence directly without qualification or condescension based on gender or circumstance. We should get back, she said, thinking suddenly of Grace waiting at the ranch. Lynn will be worried. They rode toward Whispering Pines at a measured pace, both horses and riders needing recovery on him after the intense chase. Eleanor found herself watching Jackson's profile against the afternoon sky, noting the controlled tension in his posture, the alertness that hadn't fully subsided despite the immediate threat being neutralized. Blackwood's escalating, she observed, moving from intimidation to direct action. Jackson nodded grimly. Our organizing efforts must be having an effect. He's feeling threatened enough to take greater risks. Or desperate enough, Eleanor countered. The spring thaw is coming. Once farmers can work their fields again, once cattle can be moved to summer pastures, water access becomes immediately critical. He may be running out of time to secure control. The assessment made strategic sense. Winter had provided a natural pause in agricultural activities, minimizing the immediate impact of water access issues. But with spring approaching, Blackwood's incomplete control of the watershed would soon become evident to every farmer and rancher in the region. His timetable for consolidating power was not entirely self-determined. Either way, we need to accelerate our own efforts, Jackson concluded. Today's incident gives Thornton something concrete to act upon: identified men, clear attempted murder witnesses beyond just the two of us. And it confirms which properties Blackwood considers most threatening. Eleanor added, thinking of the German family they just recruited. He wouldn't have men watching that particular road, unless he knew what we were doing. The implication was concerning their network had a leak somewhere, or Blackwood's surveillance was more comprehensive than they'd realized. Either possibility required immediate attention to prevent further targeting of vulnerable allies. As they approached Whispering Pines, Eleanor was struck by how fundamentally her perspective had shifted since first arriving during the December blizzard. What had begun as emergency shelter had evolved into a base of operations for community organizing, a center of resistance against exploitation. And Jackson Whitaker, initially perceived as a reluctant host and former enemy, had become a trusted partner in creating something that transcended their individual concerns. Lynn stood on the porch, Grace in her arms, anxiety evident in her posture until she spotted them approaching. Relief washed over her features, followed by sharp assessment of their condition as they drew closer. "Mates and men bring prisoners," she reported as they dismounted. "Say you chase shot at. Grace safe whole time, never no danger." Eleanor took her daughter gratefully, the solid weight of the baby in her arms providing essential grounding after the day's events. Grace gurgled happily, oblivious to how close she had come to losing her mother, her tiny hands reaching for Eleanor's face with perfect trust in the world's fundamental safety. "We're fine," Jackson assured Lynn, "thanks to quick thinking and quicker riding." Lynn's shrewd gaze moved between them, noting their mud-splattered clothing and the lingering tension in their movements. "Blackwood men try kill now, not just scare. Very dangerous time coming." Yes, Eleanor agreed, following Lynn into the house while Jackson remained outside to confer with Mason about securing the prisoners. "But it also means we're making progress. He wouldn't react so strongly if our efforts weren't having an effect." Lynn nodded, her expression resolute despite obvious concern. "True victory never come easy. Always costs something." She gestured toward the kitchen. "Sit, hold baby, drink tea. I make something strong for nerves." Eleanor accepted this practical advice, settling into the rocking chair that had become hers over the past months. As she held Grace and sipped the fragrant tea, Lynn provided, she found herself contemplating the strange journey that had brought her to this moment, from desperate widow pulling a wagon across frozen ground to central figure in a community resistance effort. The homestead claim that had driven her westward remained unclaimed. In practical terms, its development postponed by Blackwood's threats. Yet Eleanor no longer viewed this as failure or even temporary setback. The land itself was secondary to what it represented: a place in a community worth fighting for, a future where Grace could grow up amid justice rather than exploitation, connection rather than isolation. Jackson joined them shortly, having made arrangements for the prisoners' security until Thornton arrived. He accepted tea from Lynn with a nod of thanks, his movements displaying the controlled precision Eleanor had come to recognize as his response to stress, not suppression of emotion, but its channeling into purposeful action. "Thornton should arrive by nightfall," he reported. "The prisoners aren't talking much, but one carried papers identifying him as Blackwood's employee. Direct connection, finally. Evidence Thornton can use," Eleanor noted. "Perhaps the beginning of a legal case strong enough to overcome Blackwood's influence." "Perhaps," Jackson acknowledged, though his tone suggested reasonable skepticism about legal remedies alone. "At minimum, it demonstrates to our network that resistance isn't futile, that Blackwood's men can be caught," his tactics countered. Lynn nodded emphatically. "Community need hope, need see victory possible. Today, important for spirit, not just evidence." The simple observation captured something essential about their struggle. Beyond legal strategies and practical countermeasures, communities required belief in the possibility of success to sustain resistance against powerful opponents. Today's events, while dangerous, provided tangible proof that Blackwood was not invincible, that coordinated action could effectively counter his intimidation tactics. As they discussed next steps and security measures for the most vulnerable network members, Eleanor found herself watching Jackson with a new awareness. His calm competence during the chase and confrontation, his immediate recognition of her strategic thinking, his focus now on protecting others rather than merely securing their own safety, they'd all revealed character dimensions beyond what their daily interactions at Whispering Pines had demonstrated. This was a man shaped by conflict, but not defined by it, capable of decisive action without sacrificing compassion or consideration. The former Confederate officer who had once represented everything she opposed had become someone whose values aligned fundamentally with her own, despite their different paths to this shared understanding. Grace fell asleep in Eleanor's arms, her small face peaceful in complete contrast to the day's tensions. Looking at her daughter, Eleanor felt renewed commitment to the cause they'd undertaken. This wasn't merely about land ownership or water rights as abstract legal concepts. It was about the fundamental conditions that allowed families to thrive rather than merely survive. About ensuring Grace would inherit a community governed by justice rather than power, by mutual support rather than exploitation. "We should write to Rebecca," she said suddenly, the thought emerging from her reflections on what truly mattered in their situation. "Tell her what's happening here before she arrives. She deserves to understand what she'll be walking into." Jackson looked up, surprise briefly crossing his features before understanding registered. "You're right. Her visit was planned as reconnection with family, not entry into territorial water conflicts. And she should know about my role at Whispering Pines, the real role, including the community organizing." Eleanor met his gaze directly. No pretense, no temporary arrangements to present a different picture. "As Lynn said weeks ago, truth is always better than pretending." Jackson nodded slowly, something warming in his expression beyond mere agreement with her practical suggestion. "I'll write tonight. Full disclosure, including the events of today." The decision felt significant beyond its immediate practical implications. They were choosing transparency over convenience, honest complexity over simplified appearances. It represented a commitment to building relationships with Rebecca, with each other, with the broader community based on truth, rather than accommodation or expectation. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard, where Mason and the hands maintained watchful guard over their prisoners. Inside, Grace slept peacefully against Eleanor's chest, unaware of danger averted or battles yet to come. Between these two realities, external threat and internal sanctuary, Eleanor and Jackson continued planning their resistance to Blackwood's ambitions, their partnership deepening through shared purpose and mutual respect. Deputy Marshal Thornton would arrive by evening. Rebecca's response to their letter would come in time. Blackwood's next move remained to be seen. But in this moment, with Grace secure and their course determined, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced since before the war, not just safety or purpose individually, but their essential combination. Not mere survival, but the foundation for genuine thriving. The homestead deed remained sewn into her coat, lining a tangible claim to land that was legally hers but practically inaccessible for now. Yet Eleanor no longer viewed it as her primary security or sole connection to the future. Something new had taken shape at Whispering Pines, something built on recognition rather than romance, on shared experience rather than sentiment. Something that offered Grace not just physical safety, but the richer security of belonging to a community worth defending. Whether this foundation would support more personal connection between herself and Jackson remained to be seen, evolving naturally through honest engagement rather than forced expectations. For now, it was enough that Grace slept peacefully, that Whispering Pines stood secure, and that together they had begun building something larger than individual prosperity, a community determined to resist exploitation and protect the shared resources that made frontier life possible. Outside, the first green shoots of spring pushed through melting snow, stubborn life reasserting itself after winter's dominance. Inside, Eleanor held her daughter close, watched Jackson write to Rebecca with careful honesty, and felt her own determination strengthen with each passing moment. Whatever came next, Blackwood's escalation, Rebecca's arrival, Thornton's legal proceedings, they would face it together. Not as reluctant allies of convenience, but as partners who had chosen each other deliberately with clear eyes and shared purpose. The prairie stretched endless beyond Whispering Pines' boundaries, its apparent emptiness concealing complex connections between land, water, and the humans who sought to build lives upon its unforgiving surface. Within this vastness, Eleanor had found not the isolation she'd expected as a homesteader, but the essential interdependence that made frontier survival possible. Not independence as she'd envisioned it, but something ultimately more valuable: community, strong enough to withstand both natural hardship and human exploitation. Grace stirred slightly in her sleep, one small hand clutching Eleanor's dress with surprising strength. In that simple, instinctive grasp lay all the motivation Eleanor needed for the challenges ahead. Not land for its own sake, not water as mere resource, but the future they represented for this child and all the children of families joined in common cause against Blackwood's monopolistic ambitions. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting golden light across the pine grove that gave the ranch its name. Another day ending and another beginning to follow. The cycle continuing, regardless of human conflicts or concerns. Within this eternal pattern, Eleanor and Jackson had found their shared place not through romantic destiny or convenient circumstance, but through deliberate choice based on recognition of shared values and complementary strengths. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced today's dangers, with clear assessment, coordinated action, and fundamental trust in each other's capabilities. Not as savior and saved, not as protector and protected, but as genuine partners in creating something worth defending. Something that transcended their individual histories to embrace a future where Grace might grow surrounded by justice rather than exploitation, by community rather than isolation. Outside hoofbeats announced Thornton's arrival. The next phase of their resistance to Blackwood was beginning. Inside, Eleanor met Jackson's gaze across the room, their shared purpose requiring no words in this moment of quiet understanding. Together, they would build something lasting from the challenges before them, not just for themselves, but for Grace, for Rebecca, for every family threatened by Blackwood's ambitions. The homestead might wait unclaimed for now, but a different kind of claim had been staked on community, on justice, on the future they were determined to create together at Whispering Pines.